Hey guys, tonight we drift back through time together to the fog-draped harbours of England where wooden ships creak like tired bones and lanterns sway against the mist. You picture yourself standing on a wharf, salt stinging your nose, ropes slapping against masts as sailors shout half-remembered prayers before heading into waters no Englishman has ever dared to chart. The moon hangs like a peeled pearl above you, and the whole thing feels strangely cinematic, as if you've wandered onto the set of a pirate film, except with fewer parrots and more fleas. And yes, you probably won't survive this voyage, because even the bravest mariners faced storms, starvation, and the occasional angry Spaniard with too many cannons. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now, because somewhere across the world, another night owl is lying awake, listening just like you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge onto a deck slick with tar, the smell of oak and sweat heavy around you. Elizabeth Fez has just given her cautious blessing to a handful of daring privateers, half pirates, half patriots, who are determined to break Spain's monopoly over the New World. Think Francis Drake, the kind of man who could charm a queen while also casually stealing tons of silver from Spanish galleons. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth really approved of his more cutthroat raids or whether she just winked, looked the other way, and quietly counted the treasure that rolled back into London. The first step in building empire wasn't about ruling lands, it was about poking into them, like a nosy neighbour leaning over the fence. These early voyages sought out spices, gold and new routes, but they were also a test. Could England, a small kingdom compared to mighty Spain and Portugal, even handle global exploration? Imagine clumsy maps drawn with shaky ink lines, places labelled with "Here be dragons," and sailors who thought eating oranges was optional. Cue scurvy, the original diet fad you definitely don't want to try. You stroll through Plymouth Harbour where sailors gamble away wages they don't yet have. The ships, awkward tubs compared to sleek modern vessels, seem like floating coffins. Yet there's excitement in the air, because if one of these expeditions succeeds, everyone gets rich. One quirky tidbit: some Elizabethan adventurers carried cheese wheels as both food and currency. Cheese apparently was a surprisingly stable investment, unless rats got there first. But beyond the jokes and cheese wheels, you sense the larger story forming. England wasn't yet Great Britain, not yet the swaggering empire with redcoats and Union Jacks plastered across maps. It was fragile, still recovering from religious upheaval, with Elizabeth balancing Protestant ambitions against Catholic enemies. The sea offered both escape and opportunity. Colonization at this point wasn't neat, organized expansion. It was messy, risky, sometimes embarrassingly amateur, and you, standing with the sailors, feel that blend of dread and excitement. The sound of gulls fades as your ship pushes off. The sails snap open like giant wings and suddenly you're committed. Days stretch into weeks and you stare out at a horizon that never changes. Crew members pass the time by singing bawdy shanties and carving dice from bones. You keep your distance because lice spread faster than gossip on these decks. At night, you lie awake, listening to the sea slapping the hull and wondering if the rumours of sea monsters are just drunken stories or something waiting beneath the waves. Historians still argue whether sailors genuinely believed in krakens or whether it was just a convenient excuse for why they came back empty-handed. England's early empire is less about control and more about survival. Ships get lost. Entire crews vanish. Some expeditions, like the one to Roanoke, leave behind eerie mysteries, colonists disappearing without trace, the word Croatoan carved into wood like a spooky teaser trailer. You imagine the sleepless nights those sailors endured, wondering if they'd ever see home again. And yet, even through these failures, something grows. You walk through London's muddy streets upon returning, and suddenly exotic spices, strange maps, and tales of gold begin filtering into taverns. Merchants lean in, eyes wide, while poets like Shakespeare drop sly reefer. Renses to brave new worlds. The empire is still a fragile dream, but it's a dream catching fire. You find yourself drifting along with the current of ambition. Every salty breeze carries whispers of profit and power. The Elizabethan court loves adventure stories, the common folk love gossip about new lands, and the sailors, well, they just love surviving long enough to spend their pay in a pub. This triangle of ambition, curiosity, and raw desperation forms the heartbeat of the first chapter of Empire, and as you lie back, letting the rhythm of the sea sway you, you can't help but notice how absurdly fragile it all was. A single storm could wipe away years of planning. A single cannon volley could send fortunes to the bottom of the ocean. And yet, without these shaky, reckless voyages, there would have been no Jamestown, no East India Company, no sun never sets empire. It all begins here with you clinging to a damp railing, pretending you're braver than you feel, as England tentatively dips its toes into the vast, restless oceans. The lanterns flicker on deck, the waves hum against the wood, and your eyelids grow heavy. You're not just listening to a bedtime story, you're sailing at the dawn of empire, where everything is uncertain and everything is possible. You're back on the water again, though this time the sea isn't endless blue, it's muddy, brackish and buzzing with mosquitoes that see you as an all-you-can-eat buffet. The year is 1607, and you've just trudged ashore at a patch of swampy land along the James River in Virginia. Welcome to Jamestown, the first permanent English colony in America. The ground squelches beneath your boots, your clothes are already damp, and honestly you're starting to wonder why anyone thought this was a good idea. Spoiler, it very nearly wasn't. Picture the scene. About 100 settlers, mostly gentlemen unused to manual labour, some artisans, and only a sprinkling of people who actually knew how to farm. You stand beside them as they set up flimsy wooden palisades that look more like backyard fences than real defences. The settlers are excited. After all, they're here chasing gold, hoping to strike it rich like the Spanish did further south. But as you glance around at the thick forests and watch the mosquitoes swarm, you get the creeping feeling that this golden dream is about to turn into a nightmare. The first mainstream fact: Jamestown is indeed the first lasting English settlement in the Americas. Sure, there were earlier stabs like Roanoke, but those vanished into eerie silence. Jamestown, though, manages to cling to life despite staggering odds. One quirky tidbit: the settlers brought with them a book titled The Laws Divine, Moral and Martial, basically a strict rule book that included bizarrely specific punishments, like getting your tongue bored through with a stick if you cursed at God. Imagine a colonial HR handbook, but with a medieval torture twist. As you shuffle along the crude dirt paths of the new settlement, the harsh realities sink in. The first summer brings fever, dysentery, and starvation. You watch as desperate settlers boil shoe leather into soup, dig up corpses to gnaw on bones, and stare hollow-eyed at the river, which offers nothing but brackish water that makes everyone even sicker. Historians still argue whether the infamous starving time winter of 1609-1610 led to widespread cannibalism or just a few gruesome incidents. Either way, you're very glad this is just a story, because the dinner options here are bleak. Through the haze of suffering, one figure strides with confidence: Captain John Smith. You watch him scold the lazy gentleman, declaring, "He that will not work shall not eat." His leadership keeps the settlement from collapsing entirely. But Smith is also a storyteller, prone to exaggeration. You've probably heard the tale of Pocahontas saving his life. Historians still argue whether it was a genuine rescue or just a ceremonial act he misunderstood. Either way, you notice how Smith's adventurous flair captures attention back home, where the idea of the new world becomes more romantic than realistic. Walking out beyond the stockade, you encounter the Powhatan Confederacy, thousands of indigenous people under the rule of Wahun Senakar, whom the English just call Powhatan. They've lived here for generations, and they're understandably suspicious of these pale newcomers who build fences, cut down trees, and demand food. Trade happens, beads and trinkets for corn, but tensions simmer. You watch Powhatan's warriors hover at the edges of the forest, painted faces gleaming, while the settlers clutch their muskets nervously. Jamestown teeters constantly between survival and disaster. Ships from England occasionally bring supplies along with more settlers who often arrive sick or unprepared. You hear whispers of the Virginia Company back in London, desperate for profit, urging colonists to find gold or plant cash crops. Eventually, a man named John Rolfe introduces tobacco farming. Sticky, smelly, addictive, and immensely profitable. Suddenly, the swampy colony has purpose. You feel the earth beneath your hands as tobacco plants sprout, and you realize this weed will tie America to England in ways no one can yet imagine. Tobacco is the empire's first true American cash cow, even if it ruins the soil and enslaves countless hands to tend it. Speaking of Rolfe, you witness his marriage to Pocahontas in 1614, a moment spun into a story of harmony, though in truth it's more complicated. The union temporarily eases hostilities between settlers and Powhatans. You notice the settlers' relieved smiles, hoping for peace, while Pocahontas, renamed Rebecca and baptized Christian, stands at the uneasy crossroads of two worlds. Her later voyage to England makes her a celebrity curiosity in London's glittering halls, but you can't shake the sadness in her eyes. Back in Jamestown, life is a constant seesaw. Epidemics strike, crops fail, and Powhatan warriors push back against encroachment. You hear gunfire echo through the trees during sudden raids. The wooden palisades, once flimsy, grow taller and sturdier. Yet for all the hardship Jamestown endures, by the 1620s tobacco exports flourish and new waves of settlers arrive, convinced that opportunity awaits across the Atlantic. You look downriver and see ship after ship bringing not just Europeans but also, tragically, the first enslaved Africans in 1619, a fact that carves deep into the legacy of America and Britain alike. Your senses are overwhelmed. The buzzing of mosquitoes, the reek of unwashed settlers, the heavy sweetness of tobacco curing in sheds. You almost laugh when you hear settlers debate whether glass-blowing or silk-making might be the colony's big moneymaker. Spoiler, tobacco wins by a landslide. Quirky detail. At one point, settlers try making pitch and tar from pine trees, proudly sending barrels back to England. Except the barrels leak and ruin the cargo. Probably not the glowing review they hoped for. The tension never quite leaves you. Jamestown is fragile, its survival dependent on constant resupply from across the sea. Yet in this fragile swamp settlement you feel the first roots of something much larger. England's foothold in the Americas. The experiment nearly collapses a dozen times, but each time it stumbles forward, propelled by desperation, greed, and the stubborn will to endure. As twilight settles over the palisade, you watch smoke curl from crude chimneys and hear the weary settlers hum faint psalms, trying to ignore their gnawing stomachs. Fireflies flicker like tiny lanterns around you, and the oppressive buzz of insects blends into a lullaby of sorts. This is no glamorous empire yet, just mud, hunger, and fragile dreams clinging to life in a swamp. But you can already sense how this muddy outpost will ripple outward, shaping centuries to come. Your eyes grow heavy with the hum of the night insects, the smell of wood smoke, and the muffled voices drifting through the palisade. You've survived the first shaky steps of English colonization. Barely. And though you don't yet know it, the story is only just beginning. You're not in swampy Virginia anymore. This time you're clinging to the deck of a merchant vessel sliding into the warm waters of the Indian Ocean. The smell is different here. Instead of swamp mud and smoke, you inhale salt mingled with something sweet, spicy, and mysterious. Imagine cinnamon dust clinging to your nose, cloves biting sharp against your tongue, nutmeg so fragrant it makes even damp sailor socks smell halfway tolerable. You've arrived at the spice routes, the shimmering veins of trade that lured Europeans across oceans like moths toward a candle flame. Spices were more than flavor back then, they were magic. You sprinkle pepper on spoiled meat, and suddenly it tastes halfway edible. Nutmeg and cloves weren't just for pies. They were believed to ward off plague, improve memory, and maybe even help you find romance, though historians still argue whether that last one was optimistic marketing or actual belief. Either way, these tiny dried buds and seeds were worth their weight in gold, and Europe's obsession with them drove men to sail halfway around the world. You stand among sailors unloading goods at a bustling port like Goa, Malacca, or even the fabled Banda Islands. The air hums with the sound of bargaining in dozens of languages: Arabic, Malay, Tamil, Portuguese, and now, tentatively, English. You glance nervously at the Portuguese fort looming nearby. After all, they've guarded this trade like dragons sitting on piles of nutmeg treasure for nearly a century. The English are latecomers, awkwardly squeezing into a market already dominated by Portugal and the Dutch. One quirky tidbit: in the Banda Islands, nutmeg was so valuable that a handful of seeds could buy a house in London. Yet on the islands themselves, nutmeg trees grew like weeds, and locals used the fruit mostly for jams and snacks. The absurdity of it all hits you halfway across the worlds. The aristocrats sprinkle these spices on their puddings like status symbols, while here, children kick nutmeg fruits around like soccer balls. The English edge their way into this market by founding the East India Company in 1600, essentially a start-up with royal backing. You walk into one of its early warehouses in London, dusty ledgers, crates of pepper, and nervous clerks trying to calculate profits. At first, the company is just another competitor among giants, sending out awkwardly armed ships with letters of marque. But you can already sense the slow creep of ambition. Today they're traders. Tomorrow they'll be rulers. Back at sea, you grip the railing as your ship rounds the Cape of Good Hope. Storms batter the sails, waves slam like hammer blows, and you wonder again why anyone risks this journey. The answer, of course, is money. The profits from a single successful voyage could enrich investors for life. Historians still argue whether Elizabethan and Jacobean England truly believed they could rival Iberian dominance, or whether it was just reckless overconfidence. But as you watch the sailors nurse frostbitten fingers and fevered brows, you realize they're gambling with their lives. When you finally dock in places like Surat or Bantam, you're overwhelmed by the colors: piles of saffron glowing like powdered sunlight, heaps of cardamom pods in shades of green, and chili peppers so bright they make your eyes water just looking at them. Merchants sit cross-legged on woven mats, weighing spices with brass scales. The English, awkward in their stiff doublets and woolen hose, stick out like pasty intruders in a market that has been humming for centuries. And yet, slowly, deals are struck. Peppercorns change hands, nutmeg fills barrels, and English holds in exotic ports become permanent footholds. Not everything is peaceful. The Dutch, far more aggressive, guard their spice monopoly with muskets and cannons. You hear the thunder of gunfire echo across island lagoons as rival European powers clash over what are, essentially, bags of seasoning. One strange fact: at one point the English traded away their claim to the tiny nutmeg island of Run in the Banda Islands, swapping it with the Dutch in exchange for Manhattan. Yes, the island at the heart of New York City was once bartered for nutmeg. You can almost hear modern real estate agents weeping. As night falls in the port, you sip a spiced drink that burns your throat but warms your belly. The lanterns flicker, shadows stretch long across the market stalls, and you imagine how bizarre this must have felt for sailors who'd grown up in dreary English villages. Here, the world seemed limitless, a swirling mixture of cultures, goods, and dangers. But even as trade grows, you feel a darker undercurrent. These spices don't just flow freely into Europe. They're controlled, fought over, sometimes seized with violence. Whole communities in the Banda Islands are destroyed as the Dutch enforce their monopoly. The English, not yet dominant, watch and learn. You realize they're filing away lessons, how to combine immerse with conquest, how to cloak military force in the language of trade. And as you lie back, listening to the hum of cicadas and the murmur of waves against wooden hulls, you sense that this chase for nutmeg and cloves isn't just about dinner flavour. It's about empire, about who gets to dictate the world's tastes, who gets to profit, and who gets erased. You, half asleep under the tropical sky, might dream of cinnamon rolls, but in reality you're floating through the beginning of a global system of power that will reshape everything. Your eyelids grow heavier as the night air thickens with spice and smoke. Somewhere nearby, sailors snore on deck, clutching knives even in their sleep. You close your eyes, letting the fragrance of nutmeg and clove drift into your mind like incense, soothing and strange. The chase for spice feels both exotic and absurd, but without it, the Empire's story could never have begun. You step off the spice-scented docks and find yourself pulled deeper inland, where the air is thicker, warmer, and heavy with incense curling out of temple doorways. The year is the early 1600s, and you've arrived in India, not yet the jewel in the crown, but a vast mosaic of kingdoms, languages, and markets. This is where the East India Company, still a toddler in global terms, begins its long, messy transformation from merchant to monarch. You walk through crowded bazaars in Surat or Madras, where traders sit cross-legged behind piles of pepper, cotton, indigo and silk so smooth it makes your rough wool sleeves feel like sandpaper. At first, you're just another nervous visitor. The company's men bow awkwardly before Mughal officials, hoping to secure trading rights. You hear them offering gifts, silver plate, clocks, even little mechanical toys designed to impress the emperor's court. The Mughal Empire at this time is at its height. Imagine Akbar's successors ruling over tens of millions, their palaces dripping with marble and jewels. You glance at the English traders in their sweaty doublets and can't help but chuckle. They look like scruffy interns showing up uninvited to a CEO's boardroom. And yet, somehow, deals are struck. The company gains its first trading posts, Surat, then Madras, Bombay and Calcutta. You can almost smell the cotton bales stacked in warehouses, the indigo vats staining workers' arms blue, the pepper sacks leaking their sharp fragrance into the docks. Quirky tidbit, the English often mispronounce local words so badly that entire place names morph. Madras may have come from mangling madrasa, a word for school. It's like that friend who insists on calling croissants croissants and refuses to stop. Still, the company is cautious. For now, they're guests, tenants paying rent to local rulers, middlemen in a system that's existed for centuries. You walk through their early factories, which aren't factories at all but fortified warehouses, part shop, part fortress, part embassy. They're stuffed with goods waiting to be shipped home, calicos so brightly dyed that London tailors can't keep up with demand, peppercorns by the barrel, saltpeter, a key ingredient in gunpowder, piled high in sacks. But the longer you linger, the more you notice the company's habits shifting. They arrive as humble traders, yet they start hiring guards, sepoys, Indian soldiers paid to protect warehouses. Those guards need muskets, cannons, and forts. Forts need governors. Governors need bureaucrats. You realize you're watching commerce slowly mutating into sovereignty, like a merchant quietly putting on a crown while no one's looking. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate long-term plan or just opportunism snowballing out of control. One evening, you stand by the riverbanks near Calcutta, lanterns bobbing on the water as merchants unload boats. The sounds of the bazaar, drums, hawkers, temple bells mingle into a dizzying chorus. You're struck by how much bigger the Mughal world feels compared to the handful of Englishmen here. And yet, as Europe industrializes, ships and muskets begin tipping the scales. It's like watching a mouse edge closer to an elephant, nibbling cautiously but with unsettling persistence. Quirky detail. Company servants were technically banned from trading on their own, but many did it anyway, secretly building personal fortunes. They smuggled goods out in false-bottom trunks, bribed local officials, and sent private ships back to England. You overhear them boasting over dinner, their bellies full of pilau rice and spiced lamb. The hypocrisy would be hilarious if it weren't the seed of later corruption. Then comes conflict. You hear the first musket shots crack through the humid air as the company defends its posts from rivals, not just local rulers but also other Europeans. The Dutch, the French, even the Portuguese hover like vultures. Battles flare along the coasts. Cannons roar across bays. One strange, haunting moment. The Anglo-Dutch wars at sea are partly about spice routes, partly about ego. And you realize sailors are dying thousands of miles from home over cloves and textiles. And then, in 1757, fast-forwarding through decades of uneasy coexistence, you're at the Battle of Plassey. Picture it, a humid Bengal morning, monsoon clouds hanging heavy, 3,000 company troops plus Indian sepoys facing off against a much larger local force loyal to the Nawab of Bengal. The English commander, Robert Clive, looks more like an ambitious accountant than a general, yet somehow he pulls off a victory. How? Bribery, treachery, and a bit of luck with the weather. Historians still argue whether Clive was a military genius or just a conniving opportunist who happened to be standing in the right swamp at the right time. You feel the earth shake as cannons fire, smell the acrid smoke of gunpowder, hear sepoys chanting as they march. When the dust clears, Bengal, one of the richest regions in the world, effectively falls under company control. And you realize this is the turning point. No longer mere traders, the English are now rulers, tax collectors, kings in wigs. Back in London, shareholders cheer as the company's stock soars. You walk into a coffee house buzzing with gossip, men hunched over newspapers marvelling at tales of India's wealth. Exotic words, rupees, nawabs, palanquins, slip into English conversation. Meanwhile, in Bengal, you see famine stalking villages, taxes rising, and resentment simmering. The empire's story here is already a contradiction. Wealth pouring into England, suffering settling into India. At night, lying on a bamboo mat, you can't shake the dissonance. Outside, jackals howl in the distance. Inside, company clerks count coins by candlelight, scribbling in ledgers as if the numbers could capture reality. You realize you're witnessing a quiet coup, the transformation of a trading company into a shadow government. And as you drift towards sleep, lulled by the river's murmur, you sense the scale of what's coming. From warehouses to fortresses, from clerks to governors, from traders to emperors, the East India Company has set the template for empire. and you, once again, are left marveling at how an experiment in buying pepper and silk has turned into the skeleton of British dominion over millions. The air thickens with humidity as you step off another creaking ship, but this time the scent isn't cinnamon or indigo dye, it's sugar. The Caribbean sun presses down on you like a hot iron, and the air is sticky, sweet and faintly sour from fermenting cane stalks piled in wagons. You're in Barbados or maybe Jamaica in the 17th century, and this is where the empire truly learns the power of plantations. The fields stretch endlessly, sugarcane shimmering like green knives under the sun, and you can almost hear the rustle of profit whispering through the leaves. You trudge alongside overseers, their hats tilted low against the glare. Slaves labour in the fields from dawn until well past dusk, machetes flashing, sweat dripping, the rhythm of their work punctuated by the crack of a whip. This is the grim heart of the sugar empire, endless toil fueling endless demand. In London, tea tables groan under cakes dusted with sugar, porcelain cups sweetened with heaping spoonfuls, and every lump of white crystals has passed through hands bleeding in the tropics. It's hard not to taste bitterness, even in the sweetness. Mainstream fact first. By the late 1600s, the Caribbean had become Britain's most profitable colonial possession. Sugar exports dwarfed everything else, making these tiny islands far more valuable to the crown than even vast stretches of North America. A quirky tidbit: sugar was so addictive in England that physicians debated whether it should be classified as a spice, a drug, or a medicine. One doctor swore sugar cured melancholy, another insisted it ruined teeth and morals. Spoiler, both were right. You walk into a boiling house where giant copper cauldrons bubble with cane juice, the air chokingly sweet and suffocatingly hot. Workers, mostly enslaved Africans, stir the vats with wooden paddles, sweat stinging their eyes as steam scalds their skin. The noise is overwhelming, bubbling liquid, clanking metal, overseers shouting. You can't escape the sense that you're standing inside the lungs of empire, every breath thick with sugar vapor. The triangular trade looms behind it all. You picture ships sailing from England loaded with manufactured goods, textiles, rum, guns, crossing to Africa, where they're exchanged for enslaved people. Those people are then crammed into ships for the horrific middle passage across the Atlantic, with disease, hunger, and despair suffocating the decks. Survivors end up here, on Caribbean plantations, their lives spent producing sugar that sails back to Europe. Historians still argue whether Britain's entire industrial rise was greased by these profits, but the numbers whisper a clear answer as barrels of sugar stack high in port warehouses. Walking through a plantation yard, you see enslaved families crammed into huts, cooking meagre meals of plantains and salted fish. Drums beat faintly in the night, music carried from Africa, rhythms that survive despite everything. Overseers grumble about rebellions and uprisings, but you can't help but admire the resilience. Quirky detail: planters were so paranoid about slave revolts that some islands had more forts per square mile than Europe itself. It's like trying to build castles against the inevitable tide of resistance. And resist they did. You overhear whispers of maroon communities, escaped slaves carving hidden villages in the mountains or jungles, living free, raiding plantations when they could. In Jamaica, the Maroons strike fear into planters, their knowledge of the land making them nearly impossible to suppress. Historians still argue whether these rebellions seriously threatened the empire or merely irritated it. But you sense how much effort Britain poured into controlling people who refused to bow. At night, you sit by a lantern with a planter counting profits. He brags that a single acre of sugarcane can bring in more money than acres of wheat back home. He talks casually of shipping prices, insurance, and Negro stock, as though human lives were line items in a ledger. His words make your skin crawl, but you realise this mindset is exactly what ties London's prosperity to these islands. The fine townhouses of Bloomsbury and Bath, the delicate teacups clinking in Georgian drawing rooms, they're all built on the backs of enslaved workers sweating in this brutal heat. You wander through Bridgetown or Port Royal, bustling ports where taverns roar with sailors drinking rum distilled from sugar molasses. The smell of tar, salt and booze overwhelms you as dock workers haul barrels onto ships bound for Bristol or Liverpool. Quirky tidbit. Rum became so central that at one point Royal Navy sailors received daily rations of it, mixed with water to make grog. Imagine fighting sea battles while tipsy on diluted rum. Maybe that explains some of the wilder tactics. As you lean against a post watching barrels roll, you notice how sugar has transformed not just economies but culture. Tea drinking explodes in popularity in England, fueled by sugar. Pastry shops open in London, their windows gleaming with candied fruits and frosted cakes. Children beg for sugar sticks, aristocrats demur, and sugared almonds at banquets. And even poor families try to sneak a little sweetness into their porridge. The empire's appetite seems insatiable, and every sweet bite carries the echo of chains clanking in Caribbean fields. You can't escape the contradictions. Empire paints itself as civilized, enlightened, a bringer of progress. Yet here, progress is measured in tons of sugar extracted from pain. You watch a ship set sail, its sails glowing orange in the sunset, barrels stacked in the hold, and you know that each barrel is soaked in human suffering. The irony is sharp. The British Empire preaches liberty and law at home, but here it thrives on slavery and control. Historians still argue whether Britain would have industrialized so quickly without Caribbean sugar wealth. Some say it was vital capital, others insist industry would have risen regardless. You lie back under the Caribbean stars listening to cicadas buzz, the distant murmur of drums, and the surf pounding against coral reefs. Your eyelids grow heavy, and the sweetness of empire feels more like a lullaby layered with sorrow. The Caribbean night wraps you in warmth, the scent of sugar still clinging to your skin. The empire is getting bolder now, expanding not just by trade, but by conquest, by plantations, by exploitation on a scale the world has never seen. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize this sticky sweetness will linger through centuries, staining every corner of the empire's story. The air shifts around you once again, cooler now, salted with spray and smoke. You stand at the edge of a British dockyard in the late 1600s, and before you rises a forest of masts, ships upon ships, their rigging creaking, sails folded like giant wings waiting to unfurl. Welcome to the Empire's naval muscle, the raw sinew that will hold its far-flung colonies together. Without these wooden giants, no sugar, no spices, no cotton, no empire. You rub tar from your fingers and realize that the British Empire is less about kings and parliaments and more about ropes, anchors, and cannons. You walk along the dock, boots thudding on damp planks, and sailors bustle past you. Their jackets are ragged, their teeth suspiciously absent, their conversations sprinkled with colourful curses that would make a parrot blush. The smell? A cocktail of fish guts, salt water, and unwashed humanity. Yet these are the men who will fight Spain, France, and anyone else who dares challenge Britain at sea. Historians still argue whether the Royal Navy's strength was planned genius or the accidental byproduct of constant wars, but you can feel how deliberate it has become. Step aboard a ship of the line, something like HMS Victory, though smaller in this period. The deck is crowded, every inch of space used, hammocks strung above barrels, cannons lined like sleeping beasts along the gun ports. You duck your head under low beams, hear the boatswain's whistle shriek, and suddenly the ship feels alive, a wooden city ruled by rhythm. At dawn, sailors scrub decks until their knees ache. At noon, they climb masts like acrobats. At dusk, they collapse into hammocks, swaying like cocoons above the smell of bilge water. Mainstream. Fact. By the 18th century, Britain had more warships than any other European power, and its naval supremacy allowed it to project influence far beyond its size. Quirky tidbit. The Navy rationed beer so heavily that each sailor received about a gallon a day. When beer ran short, they switched to rum, and when even that ran low, you could hear mutiny brewing faster than any ale. Imagine an entire floating city, tipsy and cranky, then tasked with firing cannons in unison. You step below deck, lantern flickering in the gloom. Sailors dice and gamble, carving initials into beams, swapping lice jokes like bedtime stories. The air is suffocating, but the sense of camaraderie is palpable. Discipline is brutal. A man caught stealing can face a flogging so severe it leaves scars for life. Yet when battle comes, they move as one body, their lives tied together by ropes and orders. You run your hand along a cannon, its iron cold against your skin, and you feel the weight of empire resting on this barrel. Outside, the sea churns, and the enemy appears on the horizon. Drums beat, orders roar, and suddenly the ship transforms from drowsy dormitory to thunderous weapon. Cannons recoil, smoke cloaks the deck, splinters fly like arrows. You duck as grape shot rattles overhead, your ears ringing. When the smoke clears, you see enemy ships broken, their masts dangling like snapped bones, while the Union Jack flaps stubbornly in the wind. This is how Britain enforces its empire, not just with trade deals and treaties, but with iron and oak. Historians still argue whether Britain's navy was unbeatable because of superior design or just relentless practice. The truth feels like both. British crews drilled constantly, loading and firing cannons until it became muscle memory. Where other navies might get off 2 broadsides in 10 minutes, the British could fire 3 or 4. That extra volley often tipped the balance. Efficiency, it turns out, can conquer continents. You wander back to the docks after the battle where shipwrights hammer at new hulls. Entire coastal towns hum with naval industry. Portsmouth, Chatham, Plymouth. The smell of sawdust, tar and iron is everywhere. Women stitch sails in long lofts. Children carry buckets of nails, and blacksmiths beat anchors into shape with sparks flying. The empire is not just built abroad, it's sustained at home by thousands of hands feeding the beast of naval power. Quirky detail, some shipbuilders experimented with copper sheathing to prevent barnacles and rot. It worked so well that British ships could sail longer without docking, outlasting rivals. Imagine showing up to a marathon with running shoes while everyone else is barefoot. That's the advantage copper gave. As twilight settles, you sit with officers sipping weak punch, listening to their stories. They boast of chasing pirates in the Caribbean, blockading French ports, escorting merchant convoys fat with sugar and cotton. Yet between the bravado, you catch glimpses of weariness. Life at sea is grueling, scurvy stalks the crew, storms snap masts without warning. You think back to those sailors gnawing on citrus, their gums bleeding until someone finally realized lemons worked better than prayers. The Royal Navy becomes more than a military machine. It's a culture, a myth, even a brand. Children in Britain play with toy ships, poets write odes to naval victories, and newspapers print woodcuts of hero. Zeke battles. The sea is no longer just water, it's identity. Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves. The refrain echoes even in taverns where drunk sailors spill beer over each other's boots. Yet beneath the glory is fragility. Ships rot, men die, budgets strain. Historians still argue whether Britain's empire was ever sustainable without constant naval dominance. You sit on a dock post, watching the tide rise, and you know the answer. Without ships, the empire would unravel like a frayed rope. Every colony, every plantation, every warehouse of spices, all depend on these creaking hulks of oak floating against storm and cannon. As night deepens, lanterns flicker on the water, casting golden ripples. The creak of rigging becomes a lullaby, the distant crash of waves a heartbeat. You lie back, the salt tang heavy in your nose, and let the rhythm of the sea rock you. The empire now sails not just on ambition, but on fleets, vast, disciplined, and terrifying. Your eyes close, and you dream of sails unfurling like wings across the horizon, carrying sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gunpowder, carrying empire itself. You blink, and the scene tilts again. The docks of Portsmouth dissolve, and suddenly you're trudging across muddy fields in Europe. The year 1756. Cannons boom in the distance, drums rattle, and the smell of gunpowder rides on the wind. Welcome to the 7 Years' War, sometimes called the world's first truly global conflict. You're no longer just watching fleets or plantations, you're standing in the middle of a clash that stretches from the forests of North America to the rivers of India, from the Caribbean islands to the coasts of Africa. If empire was a game of chess, this war is when Britain flips the board, scattering its rivals and grabbing the best pieces. Mainstream fact. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, pitted Britain and its allies against France, Spain, and their partners, and it ended with Britain emerging as the dominant global colonial power. Quirky tidbit. Some colonists in North America called it the French and Indian War, which sounds like a board game you'd find in a dusty attic, but was, in reality, brutally serious. You start your journey in the American backwoods. Picture dense forests, rivers swollen with spring rains, and red-coated British soldiers stumbling through terrain that Native American warriors know like the backs of their hands. You crouch beside George Washington, yes, that George Washington before he was a revolutionary, watching him nervously lead colonial militias against French forts. He's young, ambitious, a little out of his depth. Historians still argue whether Washington's skirmish at Fort Necessity actually sparked the wider war or was just one unlucky spark in an already smouldering tinderbox. You march with British regulars sweating under wool coats unsuited for the American summer. Drums pound, muskets misfire, and French allied Native American war parties ambush from the trees. The sound of whoops, the flash of musket fire, the panic of bayonets clashing. It's chaos. You realize quickly that Europe's neat battlefield tactics don't translate well to the wilderness. One officer mutters, "This isn't war, it's butchery," as you stumble through ferns and smoke. But the war is never confined to one continent. Blink again and you're standing on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean as cannons boom offshore. British fleets descend on French islands like Guadeloupe and Martinique, places as valuable as gold mines because of their sugar output. You taste the salty air, smell molasses in the fields, and hear the thunder of broadsides as British and French ships blast each other over who gets to sweeten Europe's tea. Quirky fact, some British politicians argued it was better to keep Caribbean sugar islands than vast tracts of Canada because men love sugar more than fur. Imagine trading whole provinces for dessert. Shift again, and now you're in Bengal. The monsoon rain soaking your clothes. The Battle of Plassey, which you glimpsed earlier, becomes part of this bigger picture. Robert Clive and his company troops don't just topple the Nawab, they tilt the balance of the war itself. By securing Bengal's immense wealth, Britain gains the resources to keep fighting across the globe. You stand in the mud as Clive grins, drenched but victorious, and you realize empire isn't just about winning battles, it's about securing funding. Historians still argue whether Britain's victory in India during this war was inevitable given Mughal decline, or whether it was just a lucky accident of bribery and timing. Either way, you watch silver coins change hands in shadowy tents while soldiers outside sharpen bayonets. commerce and conquest blend until they're indistinguishable. Then, to the Atlantic again, you're aboard a Royal Navy ship chasing a French convoy. The wind whips your hair, cannons thunder, and the ocean sprays across your face. The British Navy's discipline shows itself here, volley after volley fired with machine-like precision. You see French ships crumple, their masts toppling like matchsticks. This, more than anything, is Britain's strength, choking off enemy supplies, isolating colonies, and making the world's oceans into British highways. One quirky tidbit: the war bankrupted France so badly that some historians argue it directly paved the way for the French Revolution. You sit in a French cafe years later, sipping bitter coffee, and overhear revolutionaries cursing the monarchy's foolish spending on colonial nonsense. You smile wryly because you remember the sugar and spices fueling London's growth. The war drags on for 7 exhausting years. You trudge through mud in Germany, sit on scorched docks in Havana, stumble through jungles in the Philippines. Everywhere you go, Britain is pushing, stretching, overreaching, but somehow winning. By 1763, when the Treaty of Paris is signed, you're in Versailles' glittering halls, chandeliers sparkle, diplomats quill signatures, and the map of the world is redrawn. Britain gains Canada, dominance in India, supremacy in the Caribbean, and undisputed control of the seas. France, humiliated, slinks away, licking its wounds. But victory brings complications. You overhear ministers in London fretting, "How do we pay for all this? Taxes rise, debts balloon," and across the Atlantic, colonists grumble. You walk through Boston streets where men mutter angrily about British taxes on tea and stamps. The Empire's triumph here plants the seeds of rebellion later. Historians still argue whether Britain's overstretch after the 7 Years' War made the loss of America inevitable. As twilight falls, you sit by a campfire with weary soldiers. Their uniforms are tattered, their boots worn thin, their faces gaunt. They joke half-heartedly, swapping stories of lice and rations, of battles won and friends buried. You sip weak rum with them, and despite the Empire's soaring triumph, you feel the weight of exhaustion pressing on everyone's shoulders. The fire pops, sparks spiraling into the night sky. You look up at stars that sailors follow across oceans, the same stars that glimmer above sugar fields and Indian rivers, the same stars seen by French and Spanish soldiers wondering if their empires will survive. The war may be won, but the future is uncertain. You close your eyes, the crackle of the fire mixing with the distant memory of cannons. The 7 Years' War has reshaped everything. Britain is now the heavyweight champion of empire, its red banners stretching across continents. Yet beneath the triumph you can sense the strain, the debts, the anger, the coming storms. The lullaby of empire is never simple. It hums with both victory and unease. The smoke of the 7 Years' War fades, and you find yourself in a bustling colonial port. Boston, maybe, or Charleston, around the 1760s. The air smells faintly of salt water and ink from freshly printed pamphlets. British flags flutter from warehouses stacked with tobacco, rum, and timber. But listen closely. Beneath the creak of docks and the calls of merchants, you catch something sharper, murmurs of discontent. The empire is at its peak on paper, but here in the American colonies, cracks are widening. Tonight, you walk alongside those restless colonists as Britain faces something it never expected: the sting of 13 colonies breaking away. Mainstream fact: the American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, ended with Britain losing its most prized mainland colonies, a humiliation that forced the empire to rethink itself. Quirky tidbit: King George III reportedly had a massive collection of clocks which ticked away in his palace as the empire's own time in America was running out. Maybe he should have checked the alarm. You wander the streets of Boston in 1770, where red-coated soldiers stand guard, their muskets glinting in the sun. Locals glare, muttering about taxation without representation. You hear the sharp crack of gunfire, what will later be called the Boston Massacre, as panicked soldiers fire into a jeering crowd. 5 colonists fall, and suddenly taverns across the colonies buzz with rage. Pamphlets fly off presses faster than ale flows from kegs, each one dripping with rhetoric about liberty and tyranny. You sip bitter colonial beer and realize, once people get a taste for freedom, it's hard to unpour the pint. Stroll further, and you're at Griffin's Wharf in December 1773. The night is crisp, snow crunches underfoot, and a crowd of men disguised as Mohawk warriors hurl crates of East India Company tea into the harbour. The water smells faintly of steeped leaves, as like the world's largest accidental brew. Quirky detail: some colonists actually tried to scoop up the floating tea afterward to drink at home. Nothing says revolution like smuggling soggy leaves in your pockets. Britain responds with fury, passing the coercive acts, what colonists dub the intolerable acts. You hear doors slam as local assemblies dissolve, feel the anger simmering in taverns where men whisper about rebellion. Historians still argue whether the British could have avoided war with lighter taxation or better diplomacy. But here, standing in a candlelit meeting house, you sense the inevitable. These colonists don't see themselves as rebellious teenagers. They see themselves as Englishmen denied their rights. Then, 1775, Lexington and Concord. You're there as dawn breaks, mist curling over fields, when shots ring out, the shot heard round the world. You duck behind a stone wall as musket balls whiz past, smoke choking your lungs. The British march in disciplined lines, their red coats bright targets against green fields, while colonial militias scatter and fire from cover. It feels less like a battle and more like a crack in history opening beneath your boots. Months later, you trudge into Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress debates independence. The air is hot, stuffy, and buzzing with flies as men in wigs argue passionately. You hear Jefferson's pen scratching out those famous words, "All men are created equal," and you can't help but smirk at the irony, given how many of these men own slaves. Still, the declaration is radical thunder, and you feel the tremor roll across the Atlantic toward London. Meanwhile, Britain rallies its navy and army. You board a warship bound for New York, sails snapping in the wind. The city bristles with British troops, cannons lining the shore. You hear drums echo down narrow streets as redcoats march, confident that the rebellion will be crushed swiftly. Yet as battles unfold, Long Island, Saratoga, you watch the tide shift, colonial forces scrappy and disorganized, somehow outmaneuver Britain's professional troops. At Saratoga in 1777, you feel the shock ripple. France joins the war on the colonist side, and suddenly Britain faces not just rebellion, but an international pile-on. Quirky tidbit: Benjamin Franklin, serving as America's ambassador in Paris, charmed the French court by playing up his rustic philosopher look, complete with fur cap. The French loved it, proof that sometimes revolutions are won with muskets, sometimes with good marketing. You stumble through Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 to 78. Snow crunches under your numb feet. The air smells of smoke and hunger, and ragged soldiers huddle in tents, frost clinging to their beards. Yet under von Steuben's drills, they sharpen into a disciplined force. You watch men practice musket drills in the snow, their determination flickering like the fires that barely keep them alive. The war drags on. You hear news of British victories in the south, but also guerrilla raids that bleed the empire dry. You march with Cornwallis's army until 1781, when you find yourself at Yorktown. Cannons thunder day and night as French and American forces encircle the British. You feel the ground shake, smell sulphur in the air, and when the white flag finally rises, you know you've witnessed the Empire's humiliation. Back in London, ministers pace palaces, wigs askew, faces pale. Pamphlets denounce blunders, Parliament bickers, and King George retreats to his clocks. Historians still argue whether losing America was disaster or blessing. Did it free Britain to focus on India and other colonies, or did it permanently dent imperial pride? As you stroll past St. James's Palace, you hear whispers of both despair and determination. The irony is sharp. Even as Britain loses its American colonies, it doesn't lose its appetite for empire. In fact, the loss becomes a kind of fuel. You hear politicians say, "We must look east," and suddenly the empire's gaze fixes harder on India, on the Pacific, on Africa. America slips away, but the empire does not collapse. It mutates. At night, you walk through London streets lit by oil lamps. Children play with toy soldiers, men grumble about taxes, women sip tea sweetened with Caribbean sugar. Life goes on. The empire may have lost 13 stars, but its map is still red with ambition. You lie in your bed, the sound of distant carriage wheels fading, and wonder if the empire has truly been wounded, or if it's simply pausing, taking a breath before lunging again. The night hushes around you. You close your eyes, hearing both the cheers of revolutionaries and the grumbles of Londoners. The story of empire doesn't end with America's breakaway. It just pivots, reshaping its path like a river finding new channels. For Britain, loss becomes a strange kind of beginning. The smoke of Yorktown fades, and when your eyes open again, the air is thicker, not with gunpowder this time, but with soot. You cough gently, squinting through the grey haze, and realize you've stepped into Britain itself during the late 18th century, right as the Industrial Revolution begins to roar. The empire is licking its wounds from losing America, yet the streets here thrum with a different kind of energy. Clanking machines, rumbling steam engines, and the chatter of merchants eyeing new horizons. The empire may have stumbled, but its engines are just warming up. You walk down a cobbled street in Manchester, where chimneys belch black smoke into a sky that never looks quite blue anymore. Factories line the horizon, their brick walls streaked with soot, their windows glowing faintly with firelight even at dawn. Inside you hear the whir of spinning jennies, the clatter of looms, and the steady hiss of steam engines. The air is thick with lint, your throat scratches, and you know this is where Britain transforms from a maritime power into the workshop of the world. Mainstream fact: Britain became the first industrialized nation driven by coal, iron, and textile production. Quirky tidbit: in some factory towns, people reportedly hung laundry inside sealed cupboards to keep it from turning black with soot before it dried. Imagine pulling out socks that look pre-charred, courtesy of Empire's engines. You trudge through a mill where children no older than 8 dart between machines, tying loose threads with nimble fingers. Their bare feet slap against wooden floors, their faces smudged with grease. Overseers bark orders, and you can't help but flinch at the thought of little fingers so close to whirring gears. Yet their labour keeps the looms running, churning out endless bolts of cotton cloth. That cotton, grown in colonies, picked by enslaved hands in the Kari, bean, and later the American South, shipped to Britain, woven and then exported back around the globe. Empire has become an industrial loop where even the threads in your shirt carry whispers of conquest. Coal is everywhere. You wander into a mine where the air is damp, the tunnels narrow, and the lantern light barely cuts the darkness. Miners, their faces black with dust, hack at seams of coal. The fuel that powers steam engines, ironworks, and locomotives. The ground trembles above you as carts rattle out of tunnels, and the stink of sulphur fills your nostrils. Historians still argue whether Britain's coal advantage made empire expansion possible, or if empire's trade demanded more coal. Either way, you're standing in the furnace of history, sweating under layers of soot. Then you step back outside, and the world feels faster. Canals cut across the countryside, barges laden with coal and goods gliding smoothly. Roads improve, and then, revolution, railways appear. You board one of the first steam locomotives, the wheels screeching as they bite the tracks, sparks flying, smoke billowing from the funnel. You're whisked across green fields at a dizzying speed of 25 miles per hour, which feels almost absurdly fast for the 1820s. Passengers gasp, clutching hats, convinced their organs might be scrambled by the velocity. Quirky fact, early doctors warned that such speeds could cause insanity. Yet here you are, riding the future. Back in London, you wander through warehouses stacked with goods: cotton, porcelain, sugar, tobacco, rubber. Clerks tally ledgers, quills scratching, while dock workers heave crates off ships. The Thames bristles with masts, each one a symbol of global reach. You see Indian textiles undercut by British mills, West African palm oil fueling factories, Chinese tea flowing into porcelain cups. Empire is no longer just exploration, it's industrial capitalism wearing a crown. The city itself is changing. Gas lamps flicker along foggy streets, newspapers spread gossip at lightning speed, and coffee houses buzz with debates about science, politics, and profits. You sip a bitter cup of coffee, overhearing talk of new machines that will replace workers, of fortunes to be made in railroads, of colonies ripe for investment. The Industrial Revolution doesn't just change how Britain produces goods, it changes how Britons imagine themselves. They see progress everywhere, and empire feels like its natural extension. But there's unease too. You wander into a slum where rows of cramped tenements press against each other. The air stinks of waste, children cry in alleys, and disease spreads faster than pamphlets. You realize industrial wealth is uneven, trickling up faster than down. Historians still argue whether the Industrial Revolution improved living standards overall or condemned generations to misery before reforms. As you pull your coat tighter, you feel both the promise and the peril humming in the smoke. At night, you hear the whistle of a train and the clang of factory bells mixing with the murmur of distant church bells. You see men hunched over newspapers reading about revolutions abroad, France, Haiti, Latin America, and wonder if empire's subjects will follow suit. You smell bread fresh from a bakery, the crust cracked golden by coal ovens, and yet you know the wheat is imported, the sugar colonial, the very bread an echo of empire's reach. Quirky detail. One English preacher complained that families were so obsessed with tea and sugar that they skipped proper meals. He grumbled that the nation is drowning itself in boiling kettles. You laugh softly, imagining history's sternest lecture about afternoon tea. Still, beneath the soot and sarcasm, you sense the empire hardening into something unstoppable. Britain no longer relies only on fragile colonies. It's building the machinery to dominate trade and production worldwide. Its ships are faster, its guns deadlier, its goods cheaper, and with every puff of coal smoke, the empire's heartbeat grows louder. As you lie in a boarding house at the edge of Manchester, the room smells faintly of coal dust and boiled cabbage. The walls shake as trains thunder past in the night, their whistles haunting. You close your eyes, and in your dreams the world feels like one vast machine, gears turning in London, pistons pumping in Bengal, smoke rising in Jamaica, all linked by invisible belts of empire. The Industrial Revolution doesn't just change Britain, it rewires the empire itself, fusing conquest, trade and industry into a single restless engine. And you, half asleep under a soot-stained blanket, realize you're being carried forward on that engine's relentless track, whether you like it or not. The coal smoke of Manchester drifts away, and now the air is dry, heavy, and buzzing with unseen insects. You squint against a blazing sun as you march through the vast and varied landscapes of Africa, acacia-dotted savannas, endless deserts, and tangled rainforests. The 19th century has arrived, and Britain, flush with industrial might, turns its gaze southward. Welcome to the age of exploration, partition, and conquest across Africa, where the empire carves borders with rulers and rifles rather than compasses and curiosity alone. You begin on the coast, where ships drop anchor and unload goods meant to grease the gears of empire. Bright cotton cloth, cheap manufactured trinkets and muskets are traded for ivory, palm oil, and eventually territorial treaties. The air smells of salt and palm nuts. The wharves echo with shouts in a dozen languages, and you sense the growing tension as British traders, missionaries, and soldiers push deeper inland. Mainstream fact: by the late 1800s, Britain controlled vast swathes of Africa, from Egypt in the north to South Africa in the south, all linked under the banner of the Scramble for Africa. Quirky tidbit: missionaries sometimes shipped harmoniums, mini organs, into the most remote villages, believing hymn singing would civilize faster than sermons. Imagine dragging a piano through a swamp while mosquitoes hum their own accompaniment. You follow a missionary caravan along the Niger River. The jungle is thick, the air soupy, and your clothes cling uncomfortably to your skin. At night you hear drums in the distance, punctuated by the low growl of unseen animals. Missionaries preach Christianity and European civilization while traders seek profit. You watch awkwardly as a chief accepts beads and brandy in exchange for signing a treaty he may not fully understand, words on paper that will later justify British claims of sovereignty. Historians still argue whether these treaties were deliberate trickery or genuine agreements lost in translation, but either way, they become the legal skeleton of empire. March forward, and you're in the deserts of Egypt in 1882. The sun beats down mercilessly as British troops march toward Cairo, ostensibly to protect the Suez Canal. You sip tepid water, grit crunching in your teeth, and realize this canal, just a strip of water connecting the Mediterranean and Red Seas, is the empire's jugular vein. It shortens the route to India dramatically, and without it, Britain's hold on Asia would choke. Cannons rumble in the distance as British forces crush Egyptian resistance, and suddenly Egypt becomes not just a neighbour, but a protectorate. Further south, you trek into East Africa, where British officials draw lines across maps during the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884–85. Picture diplomats in frock coats sipping brandy in smoky halls, calmly slicing Africa into colonies with pencils, as if carving a Sunday roast. You can almost hear the absurd scratching of pencils over paper, while millions of Africans remain completely unaware that their lands are being divvied up thousands of miles away. Quirky fact: one border between Kenya and Tanzania was drawn with such haste that it accidentally split Mount Kilimanjaro in half, like careless roommates dividing a pizza. But paper borders don't guarantee control. You march with soldiers through thorny bushland as uprisings erupt, local communities refusing to accept colonial domination. Spears clash against rifles, arrows against cannons, and while the British usually prevail militarily, you feel the unease of constant resistance. Historians still argue whether empire expanded because of superior technology alone, or because divisions among African states made unity against colonizers impossible. Either way, you sense the tension humming in every battle drumbeat. Now you're in southern Africa, amid the diamond and gold fields of Kimberley and Johannesburg. The ground sparkles with wealth that will fuel British coffers, but the fields themselves are brutal. Men labour in dark, dangerous shafts, the air hot and suffocating. You stoop to pick up a rough diamond, its edges sharp, and you realise it will one day glitter on a crown in London, while the hands that mined it go unmarked in history. Quirky tidbit: miners sometimes smuggled diamonds out by swallowing them, a desperate gamble that occasionally paid off and occasionally killed. You mutter a sleepy, "Don't try this at home." You also find yourself caught in cultural collisions. British administrators impose English law and schooling, often dismissing local traditions as savage. Mission schools churn out new elites, Africans who speak Shakespeare's tongue and wear European suits, yet feel torn between two worlds. You sit in a classroom where chalk squeaks against slate and you can feel the clash of cultures pressing down like humidity. Then comes Cecil Rhodes, larger than life, dreaming of a Cape to Cairo railway that would link the continent under British rule. You ride one of his early trains, the whistle shrill as iron wheels grind over rails, dust billowing behind. Rhodes boasts of progress and destiny, but you notice how often the train is stalled by rough terrain, by resistance, by the sheer impossibility of Empire's grandiose dreams. Historians still argue whether Rhodes was a visionary builder or a ruthless exploiter, and you can't help but think both. Night falls in a highland camp. Soldiers sip rum, missionaries sing hymns, and traders count coins by lantern light. In the distance, you hear hyenas laugh, an eerie reminder that empire is fragile against nature. Malaria stalks camps, tsetse flies kill cattle, and endless heat breaks men's wills. Yet Britain pushes on, driven by greed, pride, and the intoxicating illusion that the sun truly never sets on its empire. You walk into a local village, the smell of cooking fires warm in the air, children laughing as they chase each other. But the shadow of empire is never far. Taxes are levied, land is seized, traditions are bent or broken. Still, resilience shines in those laughter-filled voices, in songs sung around fires that defy silence. Quirky tidbit: British explorers were often so unprepared for Africa's realities that they brought absurd luggage, like collapsible bathtubs or crates of champagne, into jungles where even boots rotted overnight. You imagine porters rolling their eyes as another important box of fine china sinks into a swamp. As the century closes, the empire in Africa looks triumphant on maps. Vast pink swathes stretching across the continent, but you, lying under mosquito nets that barely keep the buzzing hordes away, sense the tension crackling beneath. Resistance simmers in villages, exploitation deepens in mines, and the arbitrary borders drawn in smoky conference halls will haunt generations to come. The African night is warm, cicadas buzzing like clockwork, and the stars stretch endlessly above. You close your eyes, the rhythm of drums pulsing in your ears, and realize that empire here is not just about conquest, it's about the clash between arrogance and resilience, ambition and endurance. The dry heat of Africa fades, and when your eyes open again, you're standing in London during the height of Queen Victoria's reign. The year might be 1851, and the air buzzes with excitement, soot, and the faint scent of horse manure from carriages clogging the streets. This is the empire at its most confident, its most glittering, its most self-assured. Welcome to the Victorian era, where the British believe themselves masters of progress, morality, and half the globe. You stroll along Hyde Park, where crowds flock toward an enormous shimmering palace of glass, the Crystal Palace, built for the Great Exhibition of 1851. Sunlight gleams through its vast iron and glass frame, dazzling your eyes. Inside, you hear the hum of thousands of voices, gasps of awe, and the squeak of polished shoes on marble. Exhibits line the halls, steam engines chuffing in demonstration, telegraphs clicking out dots and dashes, looms weaving bright cotton cloth, and a curious assortment of colonial treasures. Elephant tusks, Indian jewellery, Maori carvings, even jars of strange seeds from faraway lands. The message is clear. The empire is not only rich, but enlightened, bringing the world's wonders to one central stage. Mainstream fact: the Great Exhibition showcased Britain as the world's industrial and imperial leader, drawing millions of visitors. Quirky tidbit: some critics complained that visitors were so busy gawking at the machinery and exotic goods that they barely looked at the fine art galleries, proving that even in the 1850s people preferred gadgets over paintings. As you drift through the exhibition, you notice the tone of confidence everywhere. Pamphlets boast that Britain's empire is a gift to humanity, spreading railways, law and civilization. You can't help but smirk. It's hard to square that lofty rhetoric with the memory of sugar plantations, famine in Bengal and mines in Portugal, Africa. Historians still argue whether Victorians truly believed their own propaganda or whether it was just a convenient cover for profit. Step outside and the streets thrum with energy. Carriages rattle over cobbles, street vendors shout, newspapers flap in the breeze. You catch headlines about new railway lines, speeches in Parliament, and wars in far-off lands. Everywhere you look, empire is woven into daily life. The tea in every cup, the cotton in every shirt, the sugar in every biscuit, all come from colonies. You sip a hot cup of tea yourself, sweetened with Caribbean sugar, and realize it tastes of conquest dressed up as comfort. You wander down to the docks along the Thames. The smell of tar, salt and coal fills your nose as ships unload mountains of cargo. Chests of tea from India, crates of spices from Ceylon, sacks of wool from Australia. Dockworkers grunt under the weight, clerks jot figures, and the whole city feels like the beating heart of a machine pumping goods through imperial arteries. The docks are chaos and glory all at once. Rats scuttling along ropes, sailors swaying drunk on rum, and merchants counting coins with sly smiles. Quirky detail: one Victorian Londoner wrote that the city's fog was tinted brown, partly from coal smoke and partly from the sheer volume of imported spices. Imagine sneezing nutmeg every time you walk outside. Further uptown, you stroll past townhouses where gas lamps glow warmly and parlours gleam with furniture carved from colonial teak. Middle-class families sip tea served in porcelain decorated with oriental motifs, while fathers read about colonial adventures in serialized novels. Empire isn't just distant conquest, it's entertainment, fashion, and identity. Children play with toy soldiers, pretending to defend forts in India. Mothers swap recipes for curries made mild to suit English palates. Even the language c'est du beau hifts, absorbing words like bungalow, pyjamas and shampoo. Yet beneath the glamour, the Victorian streets reveal unease. You duck into Whitechapel, where narrow alleys stink of sewage, overcrowded tenements sag, and hungry children beg in the shadows. The same empire that builds crystal palaces also breeds inequality at home. You hear factory whistles screech, see soot-blackened faces trudging home, and feel the sharp edge of industrial poverty. Historians still argue whether empire enriched the average Briton or merely lined the pockets of elites. Standing here in the gloom, you suspect the answer isn't flattering. Across the empire, the Victorian grandeur takes on harsher forms. You find yourself transported to Delhi in 1877, where Queen Victoria is proclaimed Empress of India. The ceremony brims with pageantry, elephants draped in silk, cannons booming salutes, officials fanning themselves under tents. The sun beats down on gilded banners as officials declare India the brightest jewel in the crown. You taste the dust in the air and hear the murmurs of Indians watching the spectacle, some impressed, others seething. But the jewel is fragile. You remember the mutiny of 1857 when Indian soldiers, sepoys, rebelled against British rule, angered by disrespect for their traditions and years of exploitation. You can almost hear the shots ringing out, see flames consuming cantonments, and smell the acrid smoke of rebellion. The revolt shook Britain's confidence, and though it was crushed brutally, it left scars on both sides. Historians still argue whether it was a mutiny, a war of independence, or something in between. You, standing amid the dust and echoes, know it was all of these things at once. Back in London, you stroll through Parliament's halls where politicians debate imperial policy under the Gothic arches of the rebuilt Palace of Westminster. Gaslight flickers against carved stone, and voices echo about tariffs, colo, knees and missions. Some MPs boast that the empire is Britain's moral duty, others grumble about the costs, yet the overall tone is triumph. Empire is no longer fragile, it is a way of life. At night, you wander into a music hall where singers belt out patriotic songs. The crowd claps along, pints sloshing as lyrics boast of Britannia ruling the waves. You smile wearily. The drunken pride is catchy but also hollow. You recall famine-stricken villages in India, bloodied fields in Africa, and you wonder if these revelers could stomach the full cost of their empire's glory. Quirky tidbit. Victorians were obsessed with collecting curios from colonies. Shells, beetles, taxidermied birds, even shrunken heads. Some parlours resembled mini-museums, stuffed with trophies from across the world. You imagine guests sipping tea under the gaze of a dried iguana, trying to act impressed. The empire's grandeur reaches into culture as well. Writers like Rudyard Kipling glorify British rule, while explorers' memoirs become bestsellers. You flip through one, reading about adventures in Africa and Asia, but the language brims with arrogance. Bringing civilization, they say, while glossing over violence. You shake your head, wondering how many readers questioned it and how many simply dreamed of their sons going off to serve the crown. As the Victorian night settles in, London glows with gaslight. Omnibuses rumble down the Strand, the River Thames glitters with lantern reflections, and Big Ben tolls solemnly across the city. You lean against a bridge rail, feeling the vibration of trains rumbling nearby, and you realise this is the empire at its proudest. Victorians believe they are building not just wealth, but destiny. A global system ordained by God, progress and industry. And yet as you close your eyes, the fog curls thicker, the coal smoke clogs your throat, and you sense the weight of contradictions. For every glittering exhibition there are starving children, for every jewelled crown there are scarred backs in colonies, for every proud anthem there are whispers of resistance. The empire is a spectacle, but it's also a strain. The clock tower tolls midnight, echoing through your chest like a heartbeat. You sigh, letting the vibrations lull you, and drift towards sleep under the foggy Victorian sky. The toll of Big Ben fades, and when you open your eyes again, you're not in foggy London anymore. Instead, you're standing in a cosy English kitchen around the late 19th century. The fire crackles in the hearth, the kettle hisses gently, and the smell of strong black tea fills the air. Empire isn't just a spectacle of soldiers and parades, it's right here in everyday life, woven into habits so ordinary people hardly notice. Tonight, you walk through the domestic side of the empire, where the global network of colonies shows up not as distant battles, but as sugar in a cup, cotton in a shirt, and rubber in a shoe. You start with tea. On the wooden table sits a porcelain cup decorated with blue dragons, a design copied from Chinese imports but mass-produced in Staffordshire. You lift the cup, steam fogging your glasses, and taste the bitter leaves sweetened with Caribbean sugar. It's such a simple act, but it carries centuries of conquest, trade, and labour. By the 19th century, tea has become Britain's national drink, outpacing beer and ale. Quirky tidbit. Some moralists worried tea was making workers too lazy, encouraging endless gossip breaks. One pamphlet warned that tea rots the stomach and corrupts the soul. Yet here you are, sipping happily, feeling anything but corrupted. The empire flows into fashion too. You stroll into a milliner's shop where bolts of cotton cloth spill across counters. Brightly printed calicos from India, once a luxury, are now cheap and ubiquitous thanks to British factories. Ladies in crinolines finger the fabric, planning dresses. Tailors measure men for shirts. Even the poorest can afford some bit of cotton, and the whole industry is tied to empire. Cotton from America, dyes from India, manufactured in Britain, sold worldwide. You run your hand across the fabric. It feels smooth, light, innocent. But you know the story woven into each thread isn't. Mainstream fact: by the late 1800s, Britain imported millions of pounds of raw cotton annually, much of it tied to slave labour before abolition, and later to exploited colonial farmers. Historians still argue whether everyday Britons understood this connection or whether empire's costs were invisible behind cheap goods. From textiles, you move to the pantry. Rubber balls, gutta-percha insulated wires, cocoa tins, tins of curry powder, all sit on shelves. Curry especially fascinates you. What began as a South Asian dish becomes, in Victorian Britain, a staple of working-class meals, transformed into jarred powders that flatten hundreds of regional flavours into one exotic taste. You spoon some onto stew, the smell sharp and earthy. Quirky detail. Cooks in Britain sometimes put raisins in curry, convinced it improved the flavour. Somewhere, an Indian grandmother still sighs. You wander through a railway carriage next, the smell of coal mingling with leather seats. Passengers sip tea from thermoses, munch biscuits made with West Indian sugar, and discuss the price of cotton. Empire rides with them, literally in their stomachs and on their backs. Children clutch toys, tin soldiers, model ships, dolls in Indian costumes, while their parents read serialized novels about colonial adventures. Every small act of leisure is laced wit. The imperial threads. Back in the city, you stroll past advertisements plastered on brick walls. Posters scream about Pear's soap, promising to cleanse not just skin, but morality. One shows a white child civilizing a black child in the bath, a grotesque simplification of empire's ideology wrapped in marketing. You shake your head, but you also note how effective it is. Everyday households absorb empire not just through goods, but through the stories those goods tell. At home, you sit with a family around the dinner table. The father spreads marmalade on bread, the mother pours tea, the children munch on chocolate. Every bite carries echoes of empire. Sugar from Caribbean cane, oranges from Mediterranean groves under British influence, cocoa from West Africa. The family doesn't think of these as colonial goods. They're just breakfast. That's the power of empire. It hides itself in normality. Quirky tidbit. Victorian Britons were so obsessed with tea that entire ship designs were built purely to speed tea from China to England. These tea clippers raced across oceans, and newspapers printed results like sporting events. Imagine betting on which cargo of leaves arrives first to fuel your morning brew. You leave the kitchen and wander into a factory canteen at lunchtime. Workers gulp mugs of tea and chew on sandwiches wrapped in newspaper. Their conversation ranges from football scores to gossip about politics, but empire is there in every sip and crumb. Rubber from Malaya lines the soles of their boots. Jute from Bengal sacks their lunch. Sugar sweetens their weak tea. Empire isn't just the pomp of generals, it's the ordinary heartbeat of workers. Later, you stroll through a park on a Sunday. Families picnic on blankets, children chase hoops, and men read newspapers. The breeze smells faintly of grass and coal smoke. You notice boys with cricket bats, a sport exported from Britain to colons, eyes and re-imported back into everyday British identity. Cricket, tea and cotton, three quiet symbols that bind millions of lives together in ways most participants never pause to examine. Historians still argue whether everyday Britons were complicit in empire's darker sides or simply unaware. Standing here, watching a mother pour tea for her daughter, you realize it's not a simple answer. People knew goods came from colonies, but they didn't dwell on the violence behind them. Empire was normalized, disguised as convenience, comfort, and culture. Night falls, and you return to a row house. Gas lamps flicker, a clock ticks steadily, and the parlor glows with lamplight. The family gathers around a globe on a stand, tracing fingers across pink-painted regions: Canada, India, Africa, Australia. For them, the world feels both vast and strangely intimate. The pink patches make them proud, though they'll never see those lands themselves. You can hear the quiet thrill in the children's voices as they point to distant coasts, imagining adventure. Quirky tidbit. Some Victorian children's books included empire in bedtime tales, with heroes exploring jungles, taming tigers, and teaching savages to be proper. Imagine drifting off to sleep with bedtime stories doubling as imperial propaganda. As the night deepens, you sit with your tea, the steam curling in the lamp glow. You taste sugar, milk, and leaves that have travelled oceans. You stroke the cotton of your shirt, smooth and ordinary. You lean back in a chair made from mahogany shipped across seas. Every detail of comfort carries empire's shadow. And as your eyelids grow heavy, you realize empire isn't just built in battles and parliaments. It's built in teaspoons, in fabrics, in the quiet clink of cups on saucers. It's in the small, sleepy rituals that soothe people to bed, while far away others labour under the same empire's weight. You close your eyes to the faint tick of the clock and the smell of tea cooling on the table, lulled by the hum of an empire that seeps into the most ordinary corners of life. The cosy clink of teacups fades, and when you open your eyes again, the air feels heavier, charged with whispers. You're no longer in a parlour filled with empire's comforts. You're in the shadowy spaces where empire is resisted. Tonight you wander among the murmurs, the sparks, the subtle and the bold ways that people push back against British domination. For every pink patch painted on a map, there are voices, movements, and uprisings that refuse to be erased. You begin in India in the years following the brutal uprising of 1857. The British Raj has tightened its grip. Queen Victoria now officially crowned Empress of India, but the silence is not submission. You walk through crowded bazaars where merchants mutter complaints about taxes and laws. Pamphlets circulate quietly, written in Urdu, Bengali, Hindi, sometimes in poetry, sometimes in prose, that criticize British arrogance. One young man slips a pamphlet into your hand, and you read verses calling for self-rule disguised as devotional hymns. Quirky tidbit. Some resistance pamphlets were so cleverly written that censors, unfamiliar with local idioms, mistook them for harmless folk songs. The empire was being mocked to its face and didn't even notice. At the same time, educated elites begin forming associations, the seeds of political movements. In Calcutta, you sit in a dimly lit hall where lawyers and journalists debate reform. Some argue that Indians must prove themselves by mastering English education. Others demand outright independence. The air is thick with pipe smoke and tension. Historians still argue whether these early gatherings were truly radical or merely cautious protests, but you can feel the quiet fire in their words. Travel west, and you arrive in Ireland. The smell of damp earth and peat fires clings to the air as you walk through villages scarred by famine decades earlier. Here, resentment again. Against English landlords and absentee rule simmers constantly. Secret societies like the Fenians plot rebellion, their meetings lit by candles in barns and cellars. You listen as men whisper about uprisings, smuggling weapons, and striking at symbols of English authority. Though rebellions are often crushed, the determination doesn't die. In every pub, In every folk song sung late at night, the longing for independence thrums like a heartbeat. Shift further across the Atlantic and you land in the Caribbean. The sugar plantations may churn profit, but enslaved and later indentured workers resist in countless ways. You hear stories of men and women slowing their work deliberately, feigning illness, or sneaking away to maroon communities in the hills. The drum beats you hear at night aren't just music, they're communication, a coded rhythm that carries warnings and plans. Quirky tidbit: some colonial officials banned drums outright, fearing they were instruments of conspiracy. Imagine being so terrified of percussion that you outlaw an entire musical tradition. Resistance often turns open too. In Jamaica in 1865, you march alongside protesters led by Paul Bogle during the Morant Bay Rebellion. They demand justice for poverty and land rights, but the protest turns violent and the British respond with ferocious force. You smell smoke rising from burned-out villages, hear the crack of rifles as troops suppress the rebellion, and sense the deep scars left behind. Historians still argue whether this was a riot, a rebellion, or a revolution in embryo. You only know that the cries for dignity echo louder than the gunfire. Travel again and you're in Africa during the late 19th century. The Berlin Conference has divided lands with ink and arrogance, but on the ground, resistance is fierce. You stand with the Zulu in 1879, their warriors' shields glinting in the sun as they fay. See British troops at Isandlwana. Against all expectations, the Zulu win that day, overwhelming red-coated soldiers with sheer courage and strategy. You hear the war cries, the clash of assegai spears against bayonets, and you realize empire is not invincible. Quirky tidbit: British officers, embarrassed by the defeat, tried to downplay it in reports, but London papers made it front-page news anyway. Empire's pride dented by savages, as they cruelly wrote. Resistance isn't always war, it's culture too. In West Africa, writers and leaders begin reclaiming narratives. You listen to newspapers edited by Africans who mock colonial officials with biting satire. In Nigeria, early nationalists argue for self-determination, their speeches peppered with Shakespeare quotes, as if to prove they can beat the British at their own literary game. Historians still argue whether empire accidentally empowered these movements by spreading English education, but you hear how education turns into a weapon of resistance. Even in Britain itself, resistance takes shape. You walk through meetings of abolitionists, labour activists and anti-imperial critics. In smoky halls, speakers thunder against colonial abuses, holding up evidence of massacres and famines. Crowds clap, jeer, argue. Empire isn't a monolith. Even at home, it sparks debate. You realise resistance exists not just in colonies but in the heart of the imperial capital. And then you find yourself in the company of individuals who embody defiance. In India, you meet Dadabhai Naoroji, known as the Grand Old Man of India, calmly explaining his drain theory, that Britain is siphoning wealth from India like a vampire. In Africa, you hear from Samori Toure, who wages guerrilla war against French and British encroachment. In Ireland, you catch a fiery speech from Charles Stewart Parnell demanding home rule. Different voices, different accents, but the same steady refusal to stay silent. Quirky tidbit: some Indian students in London in the late 1800s formed secret societies that doubled as dinner club. Between curries and tea, they plotted revolution and shared news from home, all under the noses of British authorities. Imagine a revolution brewing over rice pudding. As the 19th century rolls into the 20th, you sense resistance knitting itself together. Railways and telegraphs, tools of empire, ironically spread information faster. News of uprisings travels across colonies, inspiring others. Pamphlets are smuggled, songs are sung, leaders are jailed but remembered. You hear a chant in one country, and months later you hear its echo thousands of miles away. Historians still argue whether empire's eventual unraveling was inevitable or the direct result of these constant acts of defiance. But lying here tonight, in the heat of an Indian bazaar, in the damp of an Irish pub, in the thick air of a Jamaican hillside, you know the answer in your bones. Empire may dominate maps, but people dominate time. Resistance bends, reshapes, and eventually outlasts. The night closes in, warm and restless. You hear whispers in dozens of tongues, defiant, mocking, sorrowful, hopeful. You smell the smoke of fires burning low, see eyes glinting with determination. Empire is mighty, but never unchallenged. Every clink of teacup, every bolt of cotton, every cannon boom carries with it an echo of resistance. And as your eyelids grow heavy, those echoes merge into a lullaby, not soft, not sweet, but steady, the sound of people refusing to vanish. The whispers of resistance fade, and the night reshapes itself into the dry, wide plains of South Africa. The air smells of dust and gun oil, and the grass crunches under your boots. The year is the late 1800s, and you've stepped into the harsh, drawn-out conflict known as the Boer War. Stars glitter above you, sharp and cold, while campfires flicker across the veld. This isn't the polished grandeur of the Great Exhibition, or the cosy ritual of tea. This is empire locked in a grueling struggle with stubborn settlers and endless land. Mainstream fact: the Boer Wars, especially the Second Boer War, 1899 to 1902, pitted the British Empire against the Boer republics of the Transvaal and Orange Free State, ending in British victory but at immense cost. Quirky tidbit: some British officers believed shaving daily would prevent dust-borne diseases. Soldiers dutifully dragged razors across their faces in the middle of the desert, muttering about sandpaper skin. You crouch beside a British soldier cleaning his rifle. His khaki uniform is streaked with sweat and dust, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of marching. Around him, men grumble about the endless treks across the veld, ambushed by Boer guerrillas who strike from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. Unlike European battlefields with neat lines and drums, this war is messy, unpredictable, and maddening. You ride with Boer commandos next, perched awkwardly on a pony that smells strongly of sweat and grass. These fighters, farmers turned guerrillas, know the land intimately. They hide in kopjes, rocky hills that jut like broken teeth across the plain, waiting to ambush British columns. You hear the crack of Mauser rifles echoing across valleys, see British troops scatter, and feel the eerie silence after the smoke clears. Historians still argue whether this guerrilla war reshaped modern tactics or simply highlighted Britain's unpreparedness, but either way, you feel how different this war is from the Empire's usual set-piece victories. The British respond with overwhelming force. You march with endless columns of khaki, horses snorting, supply wagons rattling. They scorch earth, burn Boer farms, and herd civilians, mostly women and children, into concentration camps. You step into one of those camps, the smell of sickness thick in the air. Tents flap weakly in the dusty wind. Children cry with hollow eyes, and rations barely sustain life. It's a side of empire rarely sung about in patriotic music halls. Quirky detail: some camps were so badly supplied that charitable British women back home knitted socks and blankets by the thousands, only to discover later that most never reached their intended recipients. You walk into a field hospital next, where wounded soldiers groan under thin blankets. The smell of antiseptic mixes with dust and blood. Nurses, some from Florence Nightingale's generation of reformers, move briskly, but resources are stretched thin. One soldier jokes weakly that the mosquitoes are fiercer than the Boers, and everyone chuckles tiredly before lapsing into silence. The war drags on for years, longer than London ever expected. You sit with officers at a makeshift map table, candles guttering in the wind. They argue strategy, point at red and blue lines, and curse the elusive enemy. Some call for harsher measures, others for negotiation. Historians still argue whether Britain's eventual victory was due to superior numbers or the sheer exhaustion of Boer fighters. Either way, the human cost is undeniable. At night, you step away from the camp. The veld stretches endlessly, the stars blazing brighter than you've ever seen. The silence is broken only by the distant howl of jackals. You think about how far you are from London's fog and bustle, and yet the Empire insists this land must be folded into its dominion. For diamonds, for gold, for prestige, Empire demands, and soldiers bleed. You wander into Boer farmhouses burned to ash, the smell of charred wood still sharp. Families huddle in camps, their lives uprooted. The British justify it as necessary, but you can feel the bitterness seeding future conflict. Quirky tidbit. British troops occasionally confiscated farm animals not just for supplies, but to race donkeys and ostriches for sport during lulls in the fighting. Imagine betting your week's wages on a grumpy ostrich sprinting across camp. And still, resistance continues. You march with Boer fighters who refuse to surrender, their beards ragged, their clothes patched, but their resolve unbroken. They fire from hidden gullies, ambush supply lines, vanish into the night. You taste their desperation in the dry bread they share with you. Hear it in the lullabies mothers hum in camps, feel it in the scorched earth beneath your boots. When the war finally ends in 1902 with the Treaty of Vereeniging, you're in Pretoria watching weary men sign papers under a canvas tent. The Boers agree to British sovereignty, but with promises of eventual self-government. You sense no triumph in the air, only fatigue. Both sides are battered, the land scarred, and the Empire's pride tempered by the price of victory. Back in London, you overhear debates in Parliament. Some MPs boast of victory, while others mourn the cost in lives and money. Newspapers print stories of concentration camps shocking the public. Historians still argue whether the Boer War exposed the cruelty of Empire most than any previous conflict. You sip lukewarm tea, listening to arguments that feel both self-justifying and hollow. Yet the Empire learns from this war. Tactics shift, military reforms accelerate, and Britain emerges with new methods of control. The war is remembered not for glorious charges, but for stubborn endurance and uncomfortable truths. It's a reminder that empire is not invincible, not inevitable, and certainly not painless. As night falls on the veld once more, you lie on your back in the dust. The stars shimmer coldly above, unblinking, as if mocking the arrogance of men who fight over land beneath them. The wind sighs through the grass, and you close your eyes, hearing both the distant thunder of hooves and the weary silence of a war that refused to end quickly. The Boer War becomes a lullaby of dust, smoke, and stubborn will. You drift into sleep knowing this struggle will echo for generations in South Africa, an uneasy reminder that empire always leaves shadows even when it wins. The dust of the veld settles, and when you open your eyes again, the scene has shifted to a much wider battlefield. You're no longer walking through South African grasslands. You're standing on a European street in 1914, the air filled with the rattle of boots, the clatter of horse hooves, and the heavy clang of church bells tolling the start of war. Not just any war, the Great War, World War I. And this time, the Empire is not fighting small rebel states or colonial uprisings. This time, the entire world is on fire, and the Empire calls on every corner of its vast dominion to join. Mainstream fact: during World War I, nearly 9 million soldiers served from the British Empire, with over 1 million colonial troops and labourers coming from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and beyond. Quirky tidbit: British generals worried that Indian troops might find European winters unbearable, so some were initially issued woolen balaclavas and tiny folding stoves. Imagine trying to fight a modern war while lugging around what looks like camping gear. You're in London first, where the city is buzzing with patriotism. Posters plaster brick walls. Your king and country need you. Enlist today. Young men queue at recruitment offices, some grinning nervously, others staring grimly. Mothers weep quietly into handkerchiefs, fathers slap backs with forced pride. And then, as ships steam out of harbours, the Empire's global heartbeat starts to pound. Troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, all summoned to fight a war that isn't exactly theirs. You follow them to the Western Front. Mud squelches around your boots, the air reeks of cordite and rotting earth, and the sky is a constant grey smear broken by the thunder of artillery. You stumble into a trench, shoulders brushing muddy walls reinforced with planks. Rats scuttle between sandbags, soldiers cough in the dam. Pee and the stench of latrines hangs heavy. "This isn't war," one soldier mutters beside you. "It's just waiting to die." And then the whistle blows. Men climb over the top, bayonets fixed, and you follow. Mud sucking at your legs, bullets whipping overhead, shells bursting with deafening cracks. You see men fall, screaming, while others stagger forward, blinded by gas. Chlorine burns your throat, your lungs clawing for air. Someone thrusts a rag soaked in urine at your face. Crude protection, but better than nothing. Historians still argue whether the general's reliance on frontal assaults was incompetence or necessity, but from where you're standing it feels like madness. Shift now to Gallipoli, where colonial troops fight and die on cliffs overlooking the Aegean. You scramble up rocky slopes under fire, heat shimmering, flies swarming. Anzac soldiers, Australians and New Zealanders, fight with desperate courage, but the campaign is a disaster. You sit beside a soldier in a shallow trench, listening as he hums a tune from home, eyes red from sleepless nights. His letters home will tell of heroism, but you know they're written between swats at flies and gulps of foul water. Quirky tidbit, soldiers at Gallipoli nicknamed their hard biscuits Anzac wafers, and used them not just for eating, but for writing letters when paper ran out. Nothing says romance like a love note on stale bread. In East Africa, you trudge through jungles where empires reach clashes in miniature. Indian sepoys, African porters, British officers, all trudging against German colonial forces in campaigns few in Europe even notice. The humidity is suffocating, mosquitoes swarm, and disease claims more lives than bullets. You hear Swahili, Punjabi and English mingling in the camp, empire's diversity pressed into war service. And in India itself, the war reverberates deeply. Over 1 million Indian soldiers serve overseas, fighting in France, Mesopotamia, Africa. You walk through a recruitment rally in Punjab, where drums beat, banners wave, and officials promise pensions and honour. Some enlist eagerly, hoping for adventure. Others join under pressure, coaxed or coerced by village leaders. Families wave tearfully as men board trains, not knowing if they'll ever return. You find yourself in France again, snow crusting the ground, Indian cavalry mounted on horses, turbans bright against the grey winter. They charge into mud and wire, lances lowered, and for a moment you see medieval bravery colliding with industrial slaughter. Afterward, survivors sit in freezing dugouts, writing letters home in careful Urdu script. Some ask about crops, others about wives and children. They describe snow as if it were an alien creature, marvelling at a cold so fierce it makes fingers crack. Historians still argue whether Indian soldiers were treated as equals or as expendables, but reading their words you know they carried both pride and pain. Back in Britain, factories roar day and night. Women fill shells, drive ambulances and run hospitals, the air thick with smoke and determination. You step into a munitions plant where young women, canaries, nicknamed for their yellow-stained skin from TNT exposure, pack explosives with nimble fingers. Their laughter hides fear. One wrong move, and the entire factory could explode. You realise empire isn't just fought abroad, it's sustained in every clang and hiss at home. The war grinds on. You sit in a trench listening to the rumble of tanks for the first time. Ungainly beasts crawling over no man's land. You hear planes buzzing overhead, dropping bombs that shake the earth. Modern war has arrived, and Empire troops are caught in its grinding teeth. And then, 1980, you march with weary soldiers as the tide turns. American reinforcements pour in, Germany weakens, and the Allies surge forward. You hear cheers in villages as bells toll the armistice on November 11th. In London, crowds flood Trafalgar Square, waving flags, weeping, kissing strangers. The Empire survived, victorious, but at a staggering cost. Millions dead, millions more scarred in body and mind. Quirky tidbit. Pigeons were still used extensively for communication during the war. One bird, cher ami, famously carried a message that saved an American battalion despite being shot through the chest. Imagine surviving trench warfare only to owe your life to a limping pigeon. But victory feels complicated. In colonies, veterans return with new ideas. They've fought for empire, bled for king and country, but now they whisper, if we were good enough to fight, why not good enough to govern ourselves? In India, nationalist movements surge. In Ireland, revolution brews. Across Africa and the Caribbean, questions multiply. The empire has never been stronger on maps, but under the surface, cracks spread. Historians still argue whether World War I marked the beginning of empire's decline or simply its reconfiguration. You stand in a quiet graveyard in France, rows of white stones stretching endlessly, some inscribed with names, others simply known unto God. Among them are Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus, Christians, all who served an empire that didn't see them as equals. The silence is heavy, broken only by birdsong. As night falls, you sit beside a dying campfire. The air smells of smoke, damp earth, and old blood. Soldiers' songs drift softly in the distance, weary voices humming tunes of home. You close your eyes, the lullaby of empire now mixed with grief. The Great War has shown the empire's strength and fragility. It has proven Britain's ability to mobilize the globe. But exposed the costs, the contradictions, the voices demanding more than medals in return. You drift into uneasy sleep, the echo of distant cannons still rumbling in your dreams. The cannons of the Great War fade into silence, and when your eyes open again, you're not in trenches anymore. You're in a world trying to piece itself back together. The year is somewhere in the 1920s, and the empire looks both triumphant and battered. Britain has won the war, but the victory feels like a hollow echo. Debts hang heavy, grief fills homes, and across the empire the whispers of independence are growing louder, no longer just whispers but steady voices. Tonight you walk through that uneasy interwar period where cracks spread through the once gleaming facade of imperial confidence. You start in London, where the air smells of coal smoke and anxiety. Streets bustle with veterans in shabby coats, some limping with wooden legs, others blind, others simply staring ahead with eyes that no longer see. War memorials rise in stone and marble, cenotaphs etched with names of the dead. Everywhere you walk, you feel the weight of absence, brothers, fathers, sons who will never return. Mainstream fact: Britain lost nearly 1 million men in the war, with millions more wounded. Quirky tidbit: artificial face masks made of copper or tin were crafted for disfigured soldiers, fragile shields that looked like eerie metallic smiles. The empire may look intact on maps: Canada, India, Africa, Australia, the Middle East, and more painted pink. But something has changed. The colonies that fought and bled for Britain now want recognition. You travel to India, where crowds gather in the hot sun of Amritsar in 1919. Families, students, farmers, all gathered peacefully in Jallianwala Bagh. You hear their chatter, smell fried snacks sold by hawkers, feel the warmth of a festival atmosphere. Then shots ring out. General Dyer orders his troops to fire without warning. You cover your ears as rifles crack again and again, bullets ripping into unarmed civilians trapped by high walls. Hundreds fall, the dust soaked with blood, the cries unbearable. Historians still argue whether Dyer acted out of cold calculation or blind panic, but the massacre becomes a scar on Empire's conscience. You step away from Amritsar, the air still heavy with smoke and grief, and walk into halls where Indian leaders debate their response. Gandhi, small in frame but immense in presence, preaches non-violence and civil disobedience. You hear his voice, soft, steady, unyielding, as he urges Indians to spin their own cloth, to boycott British goods, to march in salt pans. The air smells of burning cloth as bonfires consume British textiles. People laugh nervously, but you sense the steel in their smiles. Quirky detail. Gandhi once led a march where followers picked up handfuls of salt from the shore, defying British salt taxes. Such a simple act, yet so subversive that the empire trembled. From India, you sail to Ireland. Dublin's streets are tense, scarred by the Easter Rising of 1916. You step into the General Post Office, still pocked with bullet holes, and imagine the rebels' desperate stand. Though crushed, their dream grows. By the early 1920s, Ireland erupts into war of independence. You hear the crack of rifles in dark alleys, smell smoke from ambushes, see young men in flat caps and trench coats vanish into shadows. British forces retaliate with black and tans, their brutality infamous. Historians still argue whether British overreaction hastened Irish independence, but by 1921 the Free State is born. For the first time, the empire loses a major piece, not by rebellion abroad, but by fracture on its doorstep. Shift again, and you're in the Middle East. The war's end carved new borders with careless pens. You sit in a Paris conference room in 1919, the air thick with cigar smoke, as diplomats divide Ottoman lands into mandates: Palestine, Iraq, Transjordan, now under British control. You can almost hear the scratching pencils, smell the ink, feel the arrogance of men redrawing ancient lands as if they were puzzle pieces. Outside, resentment simmers. In Cairo, you hear chants for independence. In Iraq, uprisings flare against British rule. You ride through deserts where British armoured cars patrol dusty roads, the hum of engines jarring against the timeless silence of sand dunes. Back in Africa, the interwar years bring both infrastructure and resistance. You stand by new railways, smelling creosote on fresh sleepers, watching locomotives cut across savannah. Officials boast of progress, but local farmers grumble about taxes and forced labour. In Kenya, you overhear Kikuyu elders whispering about land seizures. In West Africa, students in mission schools debate politics, quoting Shakespeare even as they plan for freedom. Quirky tidbit: some African activists used football clubs as covers for political meetings, dribbling and passing by day, plotting independence by night. Meanwhile, Britain itself staggers. The 1920s bring strikes, unemployment, and the Great Depression looms. You walk through coal towns where men stand in breadlines, the air filled with despair. Empire goods still arrive: tea, cotton, sugar, but fewer can afford them. Politicians insist the empire is Britain's safety net, yet critics mutter that it's also a burden. Historians still argue whether empire helped Britain weather economic storms or simply drained resources further. You wander into a music hall where the atmosphere is strangely defiant. Singers belt out jaunty songs, crowds clap, beer sloshes. Keep the home fires burning, they sing, even as those fires are fueled by coal dug in desperation. Empire becomes an escape in popular culture, adventure novels, films about daring explorers, newsreels showing pomp and parades. Children still point at globes painted pink, but their fathers mutter about taxes and shortages. At night, you join a gathering of intellectuals in Bloomsbury. The room smells of tobacco and tea, papers scattered across tables, while writers, artists, and activists argue fiercely about the morality of empire. Some defend it as civilization's duty, others condemn it as exploitation. Voices rise, hands wave, and you realize even within Britain the empire is no longer unchallenged. Quirky tidbit. One MP suggested during a 1920s debate that colonies should send representatives to Parliament, creating a kind of world House of Commons. The idea was quickly shelved, too radical for its time but oddly ahead of its age. The empire staggers into the 1930s, battered by depression, unrest, and constant negotiations with colonies demanding more autonomy. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa already enjoy dominion status, governing themselves in most matters. India pushes harder for self-rule, Ireland drifts further away, and Africa and the Caribbean wait in restless patience. You sit in a railway carriage reading a newspaper, Britain's world role questioned. The words feel heavier than the paper they're printed on. As twilight falls, you find yourself in a quiet English village. Children play cricket on the green, their bats made of willow, their balls bouncing across grass. Mothers call them home for supper, the smell of stew drifting from cottages. To them, empire is distant, invisible. But to you, lying on the grass, you know the cricket bats are bound to cotton exports, the sugar in their pudding tied to plantations, the very peace of this evening secured by soldiers abroad. The interwar years hum with contradictions, grief and pride, progress and protest, stability and fracture. Historians still argue whether Britain squandered its victory or simply held off decline for another generation. You, closing your eyes under the fading sun, feel the tension like a string pulled taut. The empire is still standing, but it creaks in the wind and you can already hear the storm of another war building on the horizon. The night settles, filled with uneasy calm. You breathe the damp English air, your heart heavy with memories of Amritsar, Dublin, Cairo, Nairobi. The empire is no longer untouchable. It is contested, debated, resisted. You drift into sleep, the silence broken only by the faint echo of protest chants carried on the wind. The wind of protest dies down, and when your eyes open again, the world has erupted once more. This time even louder, fiercer, more desperate than before. The year is 1939, and you stand at the edge of another global war. This one is bigger, deadlier, more total than the last. Welcome to World War II, where the empire's colonies and dominions are pulled again into a conflict that will stretch from the icy North Atlantic to the steaming jungles of Burma, from the deserts of North Africa to the bombed-out streets of London. You begin in London itself. The sky is dark, the air tastes faintly metallic, and a siren wails across the rooftops. "Take cover," someone shouts, and you dash into an underground station. Crowds huddle on platforms, the air heavy with sweat and coal dust. Mothers clutch children wrapped in blankets. Men smoke nervously, and everyone listens to the drone of approaching aircraft. Then, above ground, bombs fall. The blitz begins. You hear explosions rumbling like thunder, glass shattering, buildings crumbling. Dust coats your tongue as you peek out to see flames licking across the skyline. Yet amid the terror, there's resilience. A woman in curlers pours tea into chipped mugs for neighbours. Someone cracks a joke about Hitler never hitting the pub on time. Quirky tidbit: Londoners grew so used to air raids that some slept in bathtubs, believing the curved sides might shield them from falling debris. But the war is never just Britain's. You're swept to North Africa, where desert winds sting your face and sand grinds between your teeth. The Empire's armies, Britons, Indians, South Africans, Australians, fight Rommel's Africa Corps across endless dunes. Tanks rumble like iron beasts, artillery thunders, and the sun beats down mercilessly. You ride in a dusty lorry with sepoys from Punjab, their turbans wrapped against the glare. They joke about curry versus British rations, passing chapatis cooked on makeshift stoves, yet their eyes harden when the shells start falling. Historians still argue whether colonial troops were given fair treatment compared to British forces. But standing in the desert, you see bravery that defies hierarchy. From Africa, you leap to Asia. In Burma, humidity wraps around you like a wet blanket. Leeches cling to your boots, mosquitoes whine, and every step feels like wading through soup. British and Indian soldiers hack paths through jungle while Japanese forces press relentlessly. You hear the roar of planes overhead, the crash of artillery echoing off hills, the cries of men stumbling in mud. Supply lines stretch impossibly thin, yet still troops fight. Quirky tidbit: some soldiers smeared Marmite on themselves, convinced it repelled mosquitoes. The insects, unimpressed, bit anyway. Then the Pacific. You stand on the docks in Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East. British officers sip gin, confident the fortress is unassailable. But in 1942, Japanese forces sweep down with startling speed. You hear bombs shriek, see columns of smoke rise, and suddenly the pride of empire crumbles. Tens of thousands of British, Australian and Indian troops surrender, the largest capitulation in British history. The humiliation is sharp, like a slap across empire's face. Historians still argue whether it was poor planning, arrogance, or sheer underestimation of Japan, but for those caught in it, defeat tastes bitter. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, British forces battle to hold the Suez Canal. You sit on the bank, smelling diesel and smoke, as convoys of ships slide through under heavy guard. Control of this strip remains vital, the empire's jugular vein. In Cairo, Allied soldiers fill cafes, the air thick with coffee, smoke, and tension. Conversations swirl in a dozen accents: English, Australian, Indian, Arabic. Back in Britain, the home front pulses with determination. Women work in factories, their hair tied back with scarves, riveting planes and loading shells. Fields are ploughed under the Dig for Victory campaign, potatoes and carrots replacing lawns. Children clutch gas masks shaped like Mickey Mouse faces, both comical and chilling. You bite into a bland sandwich, ration bread with powdered egg, and wonder how long people can endure. Quirky tidbit: Spam, imported from America, became so common that soldiers joked it stood for specially processed army meat. Some swore they'd never touch it again after the war. Across the empire, support pours in. Canadian troops storm beaches, Australians fight in the Pacific, Africans labour in supply corps, Indians march through deserts and jungles. The empire mobilises millions, its pink map shading into battlefields. Yet this time something feels different. Soldiers whisper, "If we can die for Britain, shouldn't we live free afterward?" In 1945, you find yourself in Europe as the tide turns. You march with Allied troops across Normandy beaches, sand slick with seawater and blood. Ships thunder offshore, planes roar overhead, and the Empire's forces fight shoulder to shoulder with Americans and Free French. You hear Punjabi voices shouting commands, see Canadian medics carrying stretchers, smell cordite thick in the air. It's the Empire's strength, diverse, vast, united in the moment. And then in May, victory in Europe. Bells ring, crowd stance in Trafalgar Square, and strangers kiss in the streets. But the war isn't over. You're in the Pacific when atomic bombs fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The flash is blinding, the heat unbearable even at a distance. The war ends abruptly with mushroom clouds staining the sky. You stand stunned, realizing the world has entered a new, terrifying age. Back in London, 1945 brings both celebration and reckoning. The city is scarred by bomb craters, families mourn the dead, and the empire is bankrupt from 6 years of total war. Victory feels bittersweet. Historians still argue whether World War II marked the beginning of empire's end. Britain may have won, but it emerges weakened, indebted, dependent on American aid. Colonies that once obeyed now expect freedom. Quirky tidbit. After the war, British children received bananas for the first time in years. Many had never seen one before. Some tried eating them with the peel still on. The empire may have spanned the tropics, but rationing made exotic fruit a forgotten dream. As twilight falls, you sit among ruins in London, the air thick with dust and hope. People sweep rubble, rebuild homes, plant gardens in bombed lots. Empire still exists, but it feels fragile, frayed, uncertain. You hear church bells and jazz music blending in the night air, a strange duet of tradition and change. You close your eyes, the distant memory of sirens still echoing, the smell of coal smoke and ration tea lingering. The empire has survived another war, but you know its shape is shifting. The soldiers who marched under its flag will soon demand something more than medals and parades. The lullaby of empire has changed into something restless, uneasy, waiting for the dawn of decolonization. The smoke of bombed-out London drifts away, and when you open your eyes again, the air feels different. It's not thick with cordite or ration-bread crumbs anymore. It's heavy with speeches, promises, and the tremors of change. The war is over. The Union Jack still flutters across vast pink swathes on the map, but the ground beneath it is shifting. Welcome to the age of decolonization, the winds of change sweeping across the empire after 1945. You begin in India, 1947. The heat presses down like a furnace, the air thick with monsoon damp. Crowds gather in Delhi, sweating, shouting, some jubilant, others fearful. Flags wave, some with the Union Jack lowered, others with the new saffron, white and green of independent India. You stand in the sweltering August night, listening as Jawaharlal Nehru proclaims, "At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom." The words tingle your skin. Firecrackers explode, drums beat, and you can smell incense and dust rising together. But alongside celebration is tragedy. Partition carves India and Pakistan apart, and you hear trains screeching into stations packed with refugees, smell smoke from burning villages, and listen to sobs of families torn apart. Historians still argue whether Britain rushed the process irresponsibly or simply lost control of events, but you know the independence came soaked in both joy and blood. From India, you sail east. In Burma, independence comes in 1948. You walk Yangon streets under a blazing sun, hearing monks chant while politicians give speeches about sovereignty. In Malaya, the smell of jungle sweat and gunpowder mixes as British troops fight guerrillas during the emergency, even while politicians negotiate eventual freedom. In Singapore, voices call for self-rule too, mixing English, Malay, Tamil and Chinese in a polyglot rhythm. You realize once empire's pride is slipping away. Quirky tidbit. In the Philippines, under American rather than British control, Independence Day in 1946 inspired some Southeast Asian nationalists to wear American-style suits at their own rallies. Fashion became politics, ties and lapels symbols of sovereignty. You smile wryly, thinking how even clothes can topple empires. Shift now to Africa. The wind is hotter here, filled with dust and defiance. In the Gold Coast, later Ghana, you hear Kwame Nkrumah's voice booming through a loudspeaker, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all else shall be added unto you." Crowds cheer, drums thunder, and you taste the dust of dancing feet. By 1957, Ghana becomes the first sub-Saharan colony to gain independence. The dominoes begin to fall. You march in Kenya, where the Mau Mau uprising crackles in the 1950s. The smell of smoke drifts from burning farms, and the air is sharp with fear. Guerrillas hide in forests, their oaths whispered under moonlight, while British soldiers patrol nervously, rifles clutched tight. In detention camps, men and women suffer beatings and worse. Historians still argue whether the Mau Mau were freedom fighters or terrorists, but you feel the desperation and determination that makes labels inadequate. Eventually, independence comes in 1963, and you see the Union Jack lowered once again. In West Africa, Nigeria gains independence in 1960. You're in Lagos, watching parades under a blazing sun. Brass bands blare, children wave flags, and the streets smell of roasted peanuts and kerosene. Britain hands over power with pomp, but also with quiet relief. Running an empire this large has become too expensive, too exhausting. You sense how decolonization is both a moral awakening and a practical necessity. Back in London, speeches echo in Parliament. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, standing in Cape Town in 1960, declares the wind of change is blowing through this continent. You hear murmurs ripple across the audience, some proud, some bitter. For Victorians, empire was eternal. For post-war Britain, it is clearly ending. Quirky detail. Macmillan's phrase, "wind of change," became so famous that British pubs and shops began using it as names, turning political rhetoric into marketing. But decolonisation isn't smooth. In Palestine, you're caught in chaos as British soldiers patrol tense streets in the late 1940s, struggling to manage conflict between Jewish and Arab communities. Explosions shatter cafes, rifles crack in alleys, and you realise Britain is losing grip. By 1948, Britain withdraws, leaving behind the creation of Israel and a region forever changed. In Cyprus, you hear bombs explode in the 1950s as the EOKA insurgency fights British forces. The air smells of orange groves and gunpowder. British soldiers patrol narrow lanes uneasy, while graffiti shouts for union with Greece. Decolonisation here is bitter, violent, drawn out. And in the Caribbean, independence movements rise with calypso songs and cricket bats. You hear steel drums ringing in Trinidad, reggae rhythms pulsing in Jamaica, voices demanding dignity along with sovereignty. In 1962, Jamaica gains independence, and the celebration tastes of rum and jerk spices, sweet smoke drifting in the tropical night. Quirky tidbit, one Jamaican newspaper joked that independence meant we can finally blame ourselves instead of the British. You chuckle because humour is its own rebellion. Everywhere, empire is unravelling, sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently. Historians still argue whether Britain granted independence graciously or was pushed by necessity. You, walking through these streets, know the truth is both. The empire is broke, exhausted, facing superpowers like the US and USSR. Yet the courage of colonised people, the marches, the strikes, the guerrilla wars, forces the issue. Back home, Britain itself is changing. Immigrants from former colonies arrive in increasing numbers. The Windrush generation from the Caribbean in 1948, followed by South Asians and Africans. You ride a bus in London, overhearing accents from Kingston, Delhi, Lagos and Birmingham all at once. The empire's people are here now, reshaping Britain itself. The smell of curry drifts from corner cafes, reggae pulses from radios, saris brighten grey streets. Empire is no longer just out there, it's inside the heart of Britain. Quirky tidbit. In the 1950s, some English landlords posted signs reading, "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs." The irony? Many of those landlords happily drank tea sweetened with Caribbean sugar and wore cotton stitched in India. You roll your eyes, because hypocrisy has always been empire's most faithful companion. By the 1970s, the map looks transformed. Pink patches shrink rapidly. India, Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Jamaica, all gone from the imperial ledger. Britain still holds some territories, but the age of empire is ending. Politicians rebrand it as the Commonwealth, a voluntary association, a family of nations. You sit in a hall where flags from dozens of countries wave side by side. The air smells of polished wood and fresh flowers, and speeches are full of partnership rather than dominion. Historians still argue whether this was genuine friendship or just Britain clinging to influence after losing power. Yet for the people in the room, it feels like progress, however imperfect. As night falls, you sit on a beach in Ghana, the waves warm around your toes, children laugh, chasing fireflies, while elders talk of independence with pride. The Union Jack is nay, replaced by the black star flag. The empire is unravelling, yet something new is forming in its place. The night hums with crickets and waves. You lie back, eyes heavy, knowing you've just witnessed the great unspooling of centuries. The winds of change have swept the empire apart, scattering its pieces into independent nations. The lullaby of empire now sounds like a farewell song, mingled with both relief and regret. The warm beach breeze fades, and when you open your eyes again, you're standing in a stately hall in London, the year sometime in the 1950s. The chandeliers glitter, the wooden floors gleam, and yet the atmosphere feels different, less imperial swagger, more careful diplomacy. The maps no longer drip with pink ink, the colonies are slipping away one by one, and Britain has had to rename its empire for a gentler age. Welcome to the birth of the Commonwealth, the strange afterlife of empire. You walk among delegates gathering for the first modern Commonwealth meetings. Flags from Canada, India, Pakistan, Ceylon and others flutter together. Men in tailored suits and women in saris mingle, the smell of polished wood mingling with incense and pipe smoke. The tone isn't conquest anymore, it's partnership. Everyone knows Britain no longer commands the globe, but nobody wants to burn the bridges completely. So the empire becomes a family of nations. Historians still argue whether this was a sincere transformation or just clever rebranding, but here in the hall you feel the careful balancing act. Mainstream fact: the modern Commonwealth officially took shape in 1949 with the London Declaration, allowing republics like India to remain members. Quirky tidbit: at one early meeting, Canada's Prime Minister supposedly complained that the tea served was too weak. Ironic, given the empire's entire obsession with tea for centuries. From London, you move outward. In India, Nehru embraces the Commonwealth reluctantly but pragmatically. You sit in his office, sealing fawaz and clicking overhead as he explains that cooperation is better than isolation. In Africa, Nkrumah of Ghana makes fiery speeches about sovereignty while still shaking hands with British officials at Commonwealth conferences. You realise the organisation is built on contradictions, independence and connection, pride and nostalgia. You wander into a cricket ground next, the summer air smelling of grass and meat pies. Commonwealth identity flourishes here in sport. Teams from Australia, India, the West Indies and England battle under the same rules, the crowd roaring with every six. You hear steel drums when the West Indies score, see Indian flags waving, taste ginger beer in the stands. Cricket, once an imperial export, becomes a way for former colonies to assert pride. sometimes by beating England at its own game. Quirky tidbit: when the West Indies defeated England at Lord's in 1950, calypso songs mocked the English relentlessly. You hum along, smiling, because sometimes revenge is best served with rhythm. Back in London, the Empire's presence reshapes the streets. Immigrants arrive on ships like the Empire Windrush in 1948, stepping onto Tilbury docks with suitcases and hopes. You walk beside them through London streets, smelling curry, jerk chicken, and spices wafting from corner cafes. Caribbean migrants drive buses, South Asians open shops, Africans study at universities. Britain, once the centre-ruling distant lands, now becomes a mosaic of those lands. Yet prejudice bites hard. Signs reading "No blacks, no Irish, no dogs" hang in windows, and whispers of resentment fill pubs. You stand in a smoky room as activists plan protests, determined to claim their place in the country they were told was home. Meanwhile, Britain faces the humiliation of Suez in 1956. You're in Cairo, where crowds cheer as Egyptian President Nasser nationalizes the canal. Britain, desperate to cling to influence, sends troops alongside France and Israel. But international pressure, especially from the United States, forces a retreat. You sit in a London cafe reading headlines. Britain's prestige damaged. The air tastes of cheap tea and disappointment. Historians still argue whether Suez marked the final nail in Empire's coffin, but the mood is clear. Britain can no longer act as it once did. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the Commonwealth grows as colonies gain independence. You sit in conference halls where leaders debate trade, aid, and development. The speeches are full of optimism, but the undercurrent is always complex. Some nations resent Britain's lingering influence, others lean into cooperation. The organisation becomes less about power and more about symbolic ties, a stage for both solidarity and criticism. Quirky tidbit: the Commonwealth Games, often nicknamed the Friendly Games, sometimes became anything but. In 1976, several African nations boycotted the Games in protest of New Zealand's sporting ties with apartheid South Africa. Even sport carried the weight of politics. You find yourself in South Africa in the 1980s. Apartheid tightens its grip, and the Commonwealth becomes a platform for opposition. In meetings, leaders from Africa and the Caribbean demand sanctions, while Britain under Margaret Thatcher hesitates. You sit in the tense air of a summit, the smell of coffee gone cold, as leaders argue late into the night. Eventually, pressure mounts, and the Commonwealth proves it can be more than a ceremonial club. It can act. Historians still argue whether sanctions truly toppled apartheid or whether internal resistance was decisive, but you know the Commonwealth gave moral force to the struggle. At the same time, Britain itself is adjusting to a new identity. You walk down a high street in Birmingham in the 1970s. Shops display saris next to suits, reggae blares from record stores, Irish pubs stand beside curry houses. The air smells of fish and chips mingling with spices. The old empire is gone, but its people live side by side, reshaping Britain's culture daily. A boy kicks a football in the street wearing a West Indies cricket cap, while his mother stirs curry in the kitchen. Quirky detail: in some schools, teachers had to learn to pronounce names from 5 different continents in a single classroom. Empire's afterlife is written in the register. By the 1990s, the empire is officially dead, but the Commonwealth endures. A patchwork of nations linked by history, language, and sometimes only inertia. You sit in Harare in 1991, the air filled with jacaranda blossoms, as the Harare Declaration commits members to democracy and human rights. Leaders nod solemnly. though you know not all will honour those words. Still, the effort shows how far the old empire has been transformed into something new. In Britain, the monarchy becomes the symbol of continuity. You watch Queen Elizabeth II touring Commonwealth nations, greeted with parades, dances, and sceptical glances. She waves with her trademark slow hand, the crowds cheer, but you feel the subtle tension, affection mixed with unease, nostalgia tangled with independence. Historians still argue whether the Commonwealth survives because of genuine connection or because nobody wants to be the first to walk away. At night, you sit in a quiet park in London. Children play cricket under dim lights, their laughter echoing. Old men on benches argue about politics, sipping tea from thermoses. Couples stroll holding hands, their skin tones a dozen shades of empire's legacy. The empire is gone, but its traces hum in every corner of life, in language, in sport, in the foods simmering on stove. The Commonwealth, fragile and odd, becomes the bridge between empire and modernity. Not conquest, not dominion, but connection, sometimes awkward, sometimes profound. You lie back on the grass, the air smelling faintly of curry and rain, and close your eyes. The empire has dissolved, but its after-image lingers, reshaped into something softer, yet still heavy with history. The green lawns of London fade, and when you open your eyes once more, you're standing in the present, streets filled with glass towers and glowing phone screens, buses rumbling past billboards for tech companies, the faint smell of coffee and fried food drifting on the air. The empire is long gone now, but its legacy is everywhere. You don't need maps painted pink to see it. It's woven into culture, language, migration, and memory. Tonight you wander through those modern traces where the British Empire lingers like a ghost, sometimes proud, sometimes troubling, sometimes simply invisible. You start with language, walk into any cafe in London, and you'll hear English spoken with accents from Lagos, Delhi, Kingston, and Sydney. English, once the tongue of a small island, is now the world's lingua franca, the bridge across continents. You sit at a table sipping coffee while students from India and Ghana swap stories beside you, and you realize this global language is empire's most enduring gift and burden. Mainstream fact. Today, English is the official language in over 50 countries, many of them former colonies. Quirky tidbit. In Nigeria, Pidgin English has developed into such a vibrant, expressive form that some joke it's more fun than the original. Move into the kitchen and empire lingers on plates. You walk through a London market, the air heavy with spices. One stall sells jerk chicken, smoke curling into the night. Another offers samosas, their pastry crisp and golden. A third dishes out fish and chips, ironically seasoned with curry sauce. You smile as you realise British national cuisine is no longer just roast beef. It's chicken tikka masala, invented in Glasgow by South Asian chefs. Quirky fact, in 2001, Britain's Foreign Secretary declared chicken tikka masala the nation's true national dish. Empire tastes like spice, heat, and hybrid invention. In sport too, the empire lingers. You attend a cricket match at Lord's, the home of cricket, where fans wave Indian flags as loudly as English ones. The West Indies team walks onto the field, swaggering, drums beating in the stands. You hear chants in Hindi, Caribbean English, and Australian slang blending together. Cricket, once an imperial export, has been remade into a weapon of pride. When India beats England on its own ground, the cheers sound like centuries of reversal, a gentle yet pointed reminder that the empire's subjects have outplayed the empire's inventors. Politics carries its own echoes. You step into Parliament, its Gothic halls humming with debates. MPs argue over immigration, trade, identity, issues tied directly to empire's legacy. Brexit debates even revived old rhetoric of sovereignty, with some critics muttering about a lost empire. Yet outside Westminster, London thrives as a global city, its streets alive with former colonial voices. Historians still argue whether Britain has ever truly confronted its imperial past, or whether nostalgia and selective memory cloud its politics. Listening to the debates, you sense both denial and acknowledgement tugging in equal measure. Now step into a museum. The air is cool, the lighting dramatic. You stand before the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, one of thousands of artifacts gathered or stolen during Empire's heyday. Visitors shuffle past, whispering in dozens of languages, taking photos. You overhear a guide explaining the debates about tea repatriation. Should the Elgin marbles go back to Greece? Should Benin bronzes return to Nigeria? The Empire's plunder is now Empire's embarrassment, yet also its tourist draw. Quirky tidbit. In the 1800s, some British aristocrats decorated dinner tables with Egyptian mummies, unwrapping them as party entertainment. Today, those same objects sit behind glass, guarded and debated. On city streets, the Empire's people live the Empire's afterlife. In Birmingham, you hear Bhangra music pumping from car stereos. In Bristol, murals honour Caribbean immigrants. In Leicester, Diwali lights glow brighter than Christmas ones. Children with parents from 4 different continents share classrooms, their playground games mixing languages and slang. You taste naan at midnight, jerk chicken at dawn, jollof rice at festivals, and you realise Empire has remade Britain into something unrecognisable to Victorians. Historians still argue whether this diversity is Empire's silver lining or its unsettled legacy, but walking through these streets, you see life thriving in the mixture. Yet the shadows remain. Debates about racism, immigration, and inequality echo Empire's hierarchies. You attend a protest in Trafalgar Square, placards raised against injustice, chants rising against statues that celebrate slave traders and colonial officials. The air smells of sweat, smoke from flares, and determination. One statue is splattered with paint, its bronze face streaked red. People argue, should we erase the past or confront it? You know the Empire never really ended. It transformed into questions Britain still struggles to answer. Quirky tidbit. During the Black Lives Matter protests, one Londoner suggested moving statues of Empire's villains into a theme park called Museum of Shame. The idea never happened, but the humour shows how memory and mockery intertwine. Outside Britain, the Empire's legacy shapes the world too. Borders drawn in haste during decolonisation remain flashpoints. India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine, Nigeria and Cameroon. The English legal system, Parliament, entry structures and even driving on the left persist in dozens of countries. The Commonwealth, strange as it seems, still gathers nations under one umbrella, where leaders pose for group photos and make speeches about unity. You attend one of these meetings, the air thick with polite applause, and sense how Empire has been rebranded into soft power. At night you sit by the Thames, watching lights glitter on the water, skyscrapers loom, planes roar overhead, and the city feels like the capital of a world still bound by Empire's threads. Tea steams in your cup, sugar swirls, your phone buzzes with messages from people in 3 continents, and you realise every piece of this moment is shaped by centuries of Empire. Historians still argue whether the Empire's legacy is mostly positive, railways, law, global connections, or mostly negative, slavery, plunder, exploitation. You suspect both are true, tangled together inseparably. Like the Thames itself, muddy and glittering at once, the Empire's story is both beauty and stain. As the night deepens, the city's hum softens. You close your eyes and hear the echoes, the crash of waves under Elizabethan ships, the cries in Jamestown, the hiss of sugar boiling. The roar of naval cannons, the songs of sepoys, the chants of independence marches, all of it merges into a single, restless lullaby. The empire is gone, but it lives on in memory, in argument, in daily life. Your breathing slows, the lights of London blur into stars reflected on the water, and as you drift into sleep, you realize the story of the British Empire is not just history, it's the world you live in now, every day, every moment,